We made this.
Engage!
Tea Earl Grey, hot.
There are times, sir, when men of good conscience cannot blindly follow orders.
What we leave behind is not as important as how we live.
I'm Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. Make it so.
Hello everyone and welcome to Make It So, a Star Trek Picard podcast. I am your host Kurt North. I have come back with a fleet of starships ready to go, ready to rock and roll. After trying to arrest Commodore O, but then realising there was 218 ships, and I quickly had to disappear. So, but yes, thank you everyone who's listened to Star Trek Picard over the last 10 episodes and the extra material that we've been putting up there, the Una McCormack interview and the book that we've done, and also the Children of Mars and everything there. Which we really do appreciate everyone who's been on the podcast as well. But we're not quite finished. We do have to go through episode 10, which is the season finale. So before further ado, I need to introduce my guest for this week. It's another new guest, and it's in the shape of Darren Mooney, host of the 250. Darren, mate, how are you doing today? And what have you been up to in this lovely world of ours that we're currently having issues with the whole COVID-19?
Thank you. Thank you for noting that I'm still in the shape of Darren Mooney. I feel like,
the shape of Darren Mooney.
While we've been quarantined, I feel like I've maybe been gorging a little bit. So thank you for the kind words there. Watching lots of entertainment, and I've found a way to watch this episode 3 times before we're talking this evening. So I'm very, very excited to kind of dive into it and talk about it with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I don't know if you've been listening to the episodes that we've been doing, but I've been away for the past 2. There's been issues with this whole situation, and unfortunately, I was down to do last week's and couldn't make it with Amy Nelson. So yeah, but these things happen, and you know We've got a lot to do. Podcasting seems to be a good way out for a lot of people. There's plenty of podcasts popping up left, right and centre. Don't Mention the C Word is one I want to mention that's popped up on the We Made This Podcast network as well, which is obviously Do Not Mention That Word. And he's going through a daily quarantine kind of podcast where he talks about various different things. Star Trek Next Generation is one of them, actually, on one of the episodes. I think that was day 5. So there's been a lot of things happening in regards to that. But as I say, we are here to talk about the episode 10 of Star Trek Picard. It is the season finale. So I will just go through when we had this release, which was it first aired on the 26th of March 2020. It's teleplayed by Michael Chabon, and the story is by Michael Chabon and Akiva Goldsman, and it was actually directed as well by Akiva Goldsman. Now, we normally ask this to everyone who comes on the show on how you're finding Star Trek Picard so far. Now, if we wanted to, we could go through a whole podcast about it because we've got a full season. But briefly, Darren, what have you made of Star Trek Picard?
I liked it. I liked it a lot, actually. Again, this is one of those things where it's very much about kind of setting expectations and in terms of measuring and how you set those. There's a lot of stuff that I really, really like about Picard. And again, we'll talk about them in the episode, particularly because it's the season finale. All that stuff in the season tends to bubble up through it. Broadly, I've really liked the characterization. I've actually really liked the approach to Picard that they've taken in the show. I really like Patrick Stewart's performance. I found myself actually warming to the ensemble over the course of the 10 episodes as well, which is very good. And I like some of the core underlying ideas. And again, we're probably going to talk about most of those when we get into kind of the finale, because obviously this is about tying a theme through them. I do think that I do think the series has some problems. I think some of those problems are kind of endemic to what we would call the Goldsman era, because I think we're officially in the Goldsman era as opposed to the Berman era of Star Trek, the one driven by Akiva Goldsman. And it's very much a similar sort of problems where the pacing is perhaps a little bit fast in places, a little bit off. There's a sense of, the production values being very much conventional television as opposed to existing of their own language of themselves. I'm thinking in particular of the score to Star Trek Picard is occasionally very, very heavily on the nose. I think I had similar issues with Discovery around the same sort of aspect of it as well. I think that, there's a sense in which the show is perhaps not willing to pursue some of its core ideas as far as they might go. And again, we're going to talk about those specifically when we talk about the finale and the plot itself. I think that the show has good ideas, has good setup, has good underlying concepts underneath it. I think that there are points at which it pulls back when it should be pushing forward. I don't think that's a problem unique to Picard. I don't think it's a problem unique to Discovery. I think that, for example, Voyager, over the course of its run, didn't follow any of its core ideas, their conclusion. I think Deep Space Nine, ironically, shied away from a couple of the big ones, and we'll talk about some of those later on in this podcast as well, because Picard has a lot of the same ideas, and it also pulls away from them in the same way that I think Deep Space Nine did as well. So I'm quite impressed, and particularly when it comes to first seasons of Star Trek shows, notoriously difficult, particularly for spin-offs. I mean, is this better than the first season of The Next Generation? Yes. Is this better than the first season of Star Trek Voyager? Yes. Is this better than the first season of Enterprise? Yes. Is this better than the first season of Deep Space Nine, excluding Duet and In the Hands of the Prophets? Yes. So, I mean, it's doing pretty well for itself, I would argue. I don't think it's quite there yet, and I'm kind of curious where it goes in the second season, but broadly speaking, I've been relatively impressed by it.
Good. I just wanted to pick up, I know we're not talking about the full season, but just something that you said there about the pacing, because that's something that I've been thinking about as well, and I'm sure that Tony and I will look into this next week when we do the season review. But the pacing, where do you think that? Because I thought early on, because they expanded the early couple of episodes from 2 to 3, that there seems when you get to kind of Absolute Candor and Stardust City Rag, that's where I particularly have pacing issues. Was that the same area that you found it, or is there other areas that you thought that have particular issues with regards to the pacing of the whole, or is it within episodes themselves?
It's kind of the whole within episodes themselves and how they relate to one another. Because again, you mentioned that thing about the splitting of 2 episodes into 3 episodes with the pilot. The pilot is basically the first 3 episodes of the show, which would be grand if those episodes were released together, and it's notable that they were released together for critics. Early reviews of Star Trek Picard were given the first 3 episodes in which to judge the show, which gives you a sense that those 3 episodes are meant to be the pilot. Problem is, if you're releasing them weekly, they tend to drag a little bit. They watch a lot better if you sit down and watch them in one sitting, as I discovered after the fact. I actually quite liked the pacing immediately after those 3. I actually really, really, really liked Absolute Candor. It's probably my favorite episode of the season, which may be controversial. But I do think that you had this thing where the plot moves in fits and starts, where it kind of sets target destinations, takes a long while to get there, and then doesn't actually dwell on actually being there. So I'm thinking, for example, this is the 10th episode. I'm going to assume you've seen all the previous ones. The journey to the artifact for Picard, which is supposed to be a big moment because obviously he was Locutus of Borg. He was assimilated. This is him going back onto a Borg cube. It's him meeting Hugh. It's him basically reconnecting with this huge part of himself and experiencing this trauma. And in fact, the whole series seems to be kind of building towards that, whether directly or indirectly. He doesn't know that he's heading to the artifact, but the audience, because we've seen Soji on the artifact, we know that he's going to that Borg cube. So the series seems to spend a lot of time building there. He puts his team together very slowly. He gets a little bit of information here and there. And then eventually he discovers that he's heading to the Borg cube. And then he's on the Borg cube for an episode. That episode is filled with action, adventure, chases. And then he's jumping off the artifact and going off to talk to Riker and Troy. And then he's on another adventure, altogether, looking for this synth homeworld. And it does feel like, that there is a kind of a pacing issue there, a structural issue there, where if you're going to do that, maybe have him spend 2 episodes on the artifact in the middle of the season, or keep him away from the artifact until the climax of the season. Although understandably they're not doing that because they have a different climax in mind. But it feels very much like it goes slow, then realizes that it has to hit a mark and goes really fast to get to that mark, and then afterwards goes, wait, where am I going again? And starts slow and then has to race again. And I mean, you could argue that's even the case in this episode. And again, this is probably a nice segue into talking about the actual finale itself. Because one of the interesting things about the structure of this 2-parter, and I quite like this 2-parter, I may say some mean things about it later on, I may kick it a little bit, that's only out of general affection. There's a lot I like here, there are some parts I don't like, but one of the things that's interesting about how it's structured is that, like a lot of Picard, it actually seems like it's structured a great deal like Deep Space Nine. So this two-part season finale is structured a lot like What You Leave Behind. And again, if you want to look in terms of plot, you can see it in terms of plot. It's very much an episode that builds towards a big space battle that's designed to be apocalyptic in scale. In Deep Space Nine, in What You Leave Behind, it's the battle for Cardassia. And that battle is resolved not through phasers or photon torpedoes or the threat of imminent genocide by ships in orbit, which is a case in both. You have the fleet over Cardassia, you have the Dominion threatening to destroy Cardassia and kill all Cardassian lives. Here you have the Romulans in orbit threatening to destroy all synthetic lives. It's instead resolved with an act of mercy, an appeal to their better natures. Here it's Picard talking to Soji and getting her to stand down. In What You Leave Behind, it's Odo beaming down and acting charitably towards the female changeling and convincing her that he will go back with her to the Great Link, and that convinces her to surrender, minimizing loss of life. Again, similar sort of structure, but what happens is you have these two-parters, which are, an hour and a half. This is, I think, an hour and 40 minutes, an hour and 45 minutes in total. But you have that structure, and then you have the story resolving at around, say, the hour and 10-minute mark of that 90-minute or, 100-minute episode. And then you have a coda that's centered entirely on the lead character that is slightly disconnected. In What You Leave Behind, it's Sisko going to the fire caves and confronting Gul Dukat and Kai Wynn, which again is a structural quirk because the writers couldn't find a way to get Sisko out of the attack on Cardassia to have it cross-cut and happening simultaneously. And here you have a similar situation as well, where the actual plot of the season is resolved about 2/3 of the way through the two-parter as a whole, and that then leaves you with the writers having to rush this conclusion with all the characters, but primarily the central and title character of the show, Picard, who has his own little sort of adventure or side adventure and spiritual awakening off the back of it. And I think that most of it works relatively well. I have some specific complaints we'll talk to when we get into the bits and pieces of it, but I think it suffers the same problem as What You Leave Behind, which is where you've got the plot ends, and then a separate plot kind of starts, and you're emotionally invested in it, but it doesn't feel like it flows organically. It feels like you were sprinting, and now you're just sort of like casually strolling, but you're strolling in the opposite direction that you were sprinting. It kind of, that's what I mean when I talk about the pacing of the show seeming like it was off.
Yeah, well, as I say, it's a good, nice little segue into what we're going to talk about, which is this episode, because you're right. You're absolutely right with What You Leave Behind. I never thought of that. I haven't had time to think about that. But you're absolutely right with that, with the end of Sisko's story in that way. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about that. I would agree with you with the episode. That it seems to just suddenly, you get through the plot, you get through to the end, and you've got this 18 to 20 minute segment which bookends what happened at the very beginning of the episode. Which is interesting in itself. So that in mind, with this episode, because it's a two-parter, I know it will be difficult to separate the two, like we've discussed on X-Files and the X-Cast podcast that we've both been on before. It's difficult to split the two episodes up, but from that point of view, what rating would you give this second part to the finale?
Probably about a 7.5. Because I think there's a lot, again, like the season itself, there's a lot that I like here. There's a lot that I really, really love here. And there's a lot I'm going to rave about. There are also some pretty serious problems with it. I think hold it back from being one of the best, say, season finales in Star Trek, one of the best series finales in Star Trek. And I think that and we'll talk about this when we get to the end, it's one of those, it has a kind of a narrative trick to it. It pulls a narrative sleight of hand emotionally on the audience in terms of what you think it's doing or what it wants you to think that it's doing, even though you as an audience member are smart enough to know it's not doing that. It wants you to think that it's going to kill off Jean-Luc Picard. It wants you to think that he's going to die. It wants you to think that this might be the end for him. Except you as an audience member know that they've already greenlit a second season of Star Trek Picard, and there's no way that's going to happen. And so what the episode does, which is both a very clever writerly trick from Michael Chabon, as one might expect, but which is also just a little bit kind of, I see what you're doing there, and you're definitely cheating, is that it brings in the actual death of Data. To pack an emotional wallop that allows it to kind of get out of jail free with the death of Picard. And again, this is a Star Trek podcast, so I'm going to use another Star Trek analogy here. It's very similar to what, say, The Search for Spock does, right? Where The Search for Spock is like, it wants to be this giant get out of jail free card because you killed Spock in the last movie, but you need to bring him back. So it works just about, and the reason it just about works is because it understands that in order to get Spock back and to justify that in narrative terms and not alienate the viewers, what you need to do is you need to offer a sacrifice that seems comparable. So it kills off Kirk's son and it destroys the Enterprise. And in that kind of sleight of hand, you as an audience member are so emotionally kind of shook by the death of Kirk's son and the destruction of the Enterprise that you're like, actually getting Spock back doesn't feel like a betrayal of Wrath of Khan. And this episode tries to do that with Picard, where it gives you this big, heroic, noble sacrifice from Picard, and then says, no, wait, he's coming back next year, never mind, but gives you an actual, very emotional, very strong send-off for Data, and hopes that you as an audience member will be like, well, that was pretty moving. I can give you a pass on that. And I do give it a pass on that, but with a kind of a little frowny face down the bottom where I'm writing my sort of grade assessment, where it's like, don't try it again, Siobhan. You get one.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I watched this last night with my partner, and she was visibly upset with the episode as it's meant to play, the way it's meant to play, and those last 20 minutes. And we'll get into the nitty gritty of that later. But the Picard thing, I completely get what you're saying, because had we not known that there was a season 2, that this was just going to be a one season job, and they announced that season 2 was coming after this episode, this would have played in a lot differently for me. But as soon as I saw him dying, my thoughts were racing through my head saying, well, he's not going to die, it's in season 2. He's not going to die, he's in season 2. Yeah. They've got a 3-year plan. So, yeah, so there is that issue. And, yeah, for the casual viewer, do they really know that there's going to be season 2? But you're playing to Star Trek audience. You're playing to a Star Trek audience, and most, I'm not saying all, but most will know that there's a season 2, and there's no way they're going to let their main character die. There was a little bit once he died and came back in the scene, in the quantum, whatever we want to call it, quantum simulation, where you thought, are they going to go somewhere really out there for season 2 with Picard? And they could have gone down that route.
The search for Picard.
Well, they could have, yeah, they could have gone down that route. But yeah, I just didn't feel that it was, and it was also the way that foretold the Golem. But before that's getting not deep in, because we're going to go a lot deeper than that. But that's basically where we're coming with. So 7.5, I would probably say about the same. Second time watching it, I thought after the first time, I thought back and I thought the last 20 minutes, really loved that. Thought the first part was quite good. I had some part, all the whole episode I had some issues with, but overall I thought it was entertaining. I don't think it would be my favourite episode of the season, but it had some fantastic moments in. So I think without further ado, we should maybe go deeper into the episode and let's have a look at it in more depth. We move quite quickly into the Borg cube, and I thought this actual image was really striking, the Borg cube in the water. I thought it was really lovely. But Narek is coming to the Borg cube and sneaks on, and Elnor's talking. This is something we really wanted to pick up with you first off, because I think this is what you were getting at earlier on with the themes and the issues that they're bringing up, and not really delving too much into it, where they could have gone a different way and gone a lot more into it. And this harks back to the Impossible Box in some way, because Elnor's talking about the XPs being better off dead, and that no one wants them. They don't belong anywhere. And then it becomes a personal issue when Seven goes, well, do I not belong? You know, is it me? Would there be any difference with me? And he says, well, no, I'd miss you. And that there's a real kind of defining line between the two of like, it's over there, it doesn't really matter. But if it's on your doorstep and it's happening to someone, then you're going to it's going to affect you in more detail. So it's having that closed offness, the kind of isolationism that we've been talking about through the season. So what did you make? I mean, it's only literally a one comment line really, but it kind of speaks to something a lot more deeper than that, doesn't it? And what did you think to that?
Well, first of all, actually, you mentioned that sight of the Borg cube in the ocean, actually, and it is a striking image. And again, this is one of the things that I think that the Goldman era Star Trek Discovery and Picard get a lot of flack from kind of critics and from people who are very cynical about them, which is this kind of idea that they just riff a lot on pop culture. And you can see that here. The sight of the Borg cube in the water looks a lot like, say, for example, the Death Star in the water in the early publicity images from The Rise of Skywalker. Later in the episode, you have the holes in the sky, like something from, say, Avengers, for example. And, you know, you have this sort of like riffing on pop culture that's happening. I actually think it works relatively well. I think it's a striking image that works in its own terms. And I also think that Star Trek has a long history of drawing from pop culture that tends to get obscured and overlooked. Like, people tend to think of Star Trek as its own thing, but it generally exists in conversation with the rest of pop culture. I mean, you have things like, for example, the motion picture blatantly ripping off 2001: Space Odyssey, to pick an example. You have episodes like Meld, which are very clearly modeled on stuff like Silence of the Lambs, Field of Fire modeled on Silence of the Lambs as well. You know, you have Ira Bear ripping off kind of classic 40s and 50s Hollywood for episodes like God Help Me, Prophet and Lace, but even episodes like Prophet and Lost, for example, which is riffed on Casablanca, or Fascination, which is based on, I think, A Midsummer Night's Dream. So I actually really like that kind of Star Trek has that sense of poppiness to it again, where it's like drawing, where it does seem to have these images that are kind of familiar, but they're recontextualized in Star Trek terms. And that idea of the Borg cube in the ocean is kind of a very striking, very evocative, very powerful image. With regards to the 7 of 9 and Elnor stuff, again, this is something where I think the pacing is a little bit of a problem, because I think that those ideas are all definitely there, right? But the issue for me is along the lines of, first of all, like, we know Seven and Elnor have spent time together, obviously, because they were on the cube together. And they have several key scenes together over the course of the season on the cube together, most notably where 7 of 9 becomes a Borg queen herself, right? But they've never really had a kind of a casual personal interaction between them. So when Elnor says, you know, no, but I like you, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's earned in the way that some of the other personal dynamics on the show feel like they're earned. Like, I actually quite like the relationships between Rios and the Doctor, for example. But, you know, or even like later on, the relationship between sort of Rios and Raffi over the course of the season as well, I think is very well developed. But because the show's been rushing so much, Elnor and Seven don't feel like they have a dynamic that you can really pay off in that short exchange between them. And again, in terms of pacing, it kind of also gets at the sense of, and it happens a bit in the season finale, this is just the first example of it, but like the XBs, where Elnor's like, well, the XBs are better off dead. And that's really the end of the season finale, focusing on the XBs, because they have so much else going on and so much else takes focus and character drama comes to the fore. And then, you know, sort of Seven at the end is, you know, not to jump too far ahead, but is on the bridge of the ship. And therefore, you know, the question is she going with Picard? And therefore, what's happening to all the XBs? And again, it's very much like Jurati, where kind of her murder of kind of Maddox earlier in the season was this huge character beat and keeps coming back and back again and again and again. But because there's so much stuff that has to be crammed into this episode, it's not necessarily paid off or developed. Jurati, you know, like there was a moment where Picard was like in the antepenultimate episode, or even last episode, where he was like, hey, we're going to drop you off on Deep Space 12, where you're going to face justice for what you did. And she's like, yep, that's absolutely fair. And at the end of this, she's standing on the bridge of kind of the ship and is like, no, I'm part of this crew now. And there's a sense of, because there's so much crammed into this episode, there's not time to unpack all of it. And again, the XB stuff kind of feels like it's a part of that, where it feels like there should be more of it, even though I'm not sure where it would go and how you'd find the time for it. But I mean, the stuff is definitely there. It is absolutely definitely there, but it does feel like it's not necessarily developed or kind of brought to the fore. It's kind of lost in the rush or the shuffle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Michael Chabon has said that they are planting things in for season 2 that they may well investigate. And if they do go down this line with Seven and with Elnor of the XB kind of thing, which they may well do, it might see in hindsight maybe that it flows a little bit better, but it definitely feels that Elnor feels like a character to me that has been brought in, is very two-dimensional in a lot of ways, but it feels like we've developed more characters. You mentioned like Raffi and Rios, for example, where we've seemed to, I wouldn't say we've fully investigated them, but there's definitely more meat on the bones on what their characters are and where they've been. But yeah, there's definitely some the meat on the bones have been developed over Jurati, Rios, Raffi, and Soji, obviously. But Elnor just seems to be almost just a caricature at the moment, and they will need to look into that in more detail. Yes, you've got the. I know that Tony and I have talked about the the books, but whether or not the books act as canon in what you don't see on TV, for example, you can't really use that. So I would expect, this is an expectation of mine, that next season, early on, that we would need to get more stuff with Elnor. So it may well be that the XPs come into that.
Yeah. So I mean, you say that though as if like every Star Trek series doesn't have a chronically underserved regular. Did he just draw the Mayweather straw? God help us if he drew the Mayweather straw or the Harry Kim straw.
Yeah. If you've got, poor Harry Kim. I mean, Harry Kim. This is just suddenly come to mind. Harry Kim goes through exactly the same thing as what Picard does at the end of this episode, doesn't he? He actually gets killed and comes back.
Yes. And nobody ever mentions it again. How weird it must be. These aren't your friends. All your friends are dead. This is a ship of strangers that you're on, Harry. And never mention it again.
Oh, class. Brilliant. But I mean, as I say, the XBs, this idea of almost like it's the refugee crisis that the kind of bouncing off. It seems to be either they've put that into the back pocket and just put it into long grass, and we'll take it from there. But you're absolutely right that the way that they seem to be just rushing everything, it could have been dealt with better. Now, I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination I could do that, but there's definitely something to look at. The next scene with the butterfly. The butterfly comes in quite a lot. There's a couple of themes that come through this episode and over the course of the show. The butterfly is a really interesting one where, Picard uses that as saying, you're free to do whatever you need to do, and then at the very end we'll talk about that. But there's also this thing with the eyes as well, because Icheb gets his eye taken out. We have the eye with Jurati takes out as well from Saga to get into into Picard's little room that he's been kept in. And there seems to be these recurring themes that are popping up here and there from the show. But what did you make of the conversation that he has with Soji here? Something that was a lot of this discussion was based on what happened last episode of part 1, where they were talking about the fear and the sacrifice. I think it's probably a good time to talk about that now, and what you felt about these themes of sacrificing yourself for somebody else, or the organics having complete control over the synths, and the synths they've been oppressed and things. What did you make to those themes that are jumping around in this episode?
Well, two things very quickly. So in terms of, before we talk about the themes, it's probably worth talking about the delivery and the tone and stuff as well. Because one of the things that I actually really, really like about the end of the season of Picard, and the two-parter in particular, is the way in which it gradually becomes a Next Generation episode. And I'm not just talking about in terms of tone or content. I'm talking even in terms of the way that it's shot, its use of location, and its use of extras. Like, look at those sequences where the synths gather and they have their conferences and they have their talks and they have their meetings in public squares. Those are sequences.
Very original series and Justice and stuff like that, and Next Generation stuff, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. It's not even like along those lines. It's also along the lines of, say, think of episodes like, say, the Masterpiece Society or The Hunted and stuff like that. It's those kind of. And again, it is shot on location. It's obviously shot arguably in much higher value, but shot for high definition or ultra high definition, stuff like that. And, the practical effects are better, special effects are better, and the use of location is probably, more expensive. But like in terms of like actual logistics, in terms of what you're shooting and how you're shooting it, it's very similar to those episodes of Star Trek, The Next Generation, Voyager, where you would have these big open square spaces. And in those spaces, you would have these big arguments and these oratorical debates and these characters just spouting kind of monologues almost and debating philosophical points. And I kind of look for all the criticism, again, that Discovery and Picard have gotten for being more action-oriented, a bit more kind of aggressive in their editing, and a bit more frantically paced. And again, I will cop to all of those. I think there's a lot of fairness in some of those criticisms. I do think that it's striking that Picard actually builds the point where it does a 21st century, 2020 version of a sequence where Picard makes an oratorical argument in front of a bunch of people trying to persuade them to change their minds, which is a pure Star Trek The Next Generation concept. As much as Picard is not trying to be the Next Generation, as much as Picard understands it can't be the Next Generation, I love that the aesthetic of those sequences, which is people talking in rooms, people talking in public spaces, people debating in front of crowds, and people trying to change people's minds. And again, just off the top of my head, I thought of that episode, The Ensigns of Command, with Data. You know, and again, you know all these things, or the Maquis episodes in the seventh season, The Next Generation. Like, you can close your eyes and you can see that set, that village square set populated with extras who are looking at our lead characters as they're delivering monologues and debating with guest stars. And again, it feels very much like one of those sequences, except, you know, this time it's shot in the desert. Patrick Stewart is a little bit older and Brent Spiner isn't wearing makeup, but it feels very much like one of those sequences. And I really, really, really appreciated that. In terms of actual theme and thematic content, this is actually something that I really, really liked about the season of Picard as a whole, and something that I think was very, very, very well done in it. And again, you mentioned the refugee crisis and its handling of stuff like, say, Trumpism and Brexit and things like that as well. One of the things that I really appreciate about Picard, and one of the things that I think it's done spectacularly well, is the handling of this idea of generational divide and this idea of a gap that exists between parents and children. Because, and again, Picard frames it like later in the episode, he talks about the synths as if they're children, because they are children. They're effectively a race of people that humanity has created and raised. They are the next they're literally the next generation, by the way, in case you don't get the subtext that's happening here. But again, you have it throughout as well, this idea of parents and children. And again, it's replicated in the macro and the micro scale. The synths are children of humanity, but Elnor is the abandoned son of Picard, for example. Raffi is his abandoned protege. Rios is like an orphan child who lost his own mentor, for example. Jurati murdered her mentor, who was also her lover, and is also possibly seen as being the mother to these children as well. And so you have this idea of kind of the dynamic that exists between parents and children. And I really like the idea that Picard kind of pushes that to the foreground, because all this stuff that's happening at the moment politically and all this stuff that Picard's delving into, and I don't want to be reductive because I think that they all deserve to be talked about on their own merits, but one of the common threads that you see in all of them is generational. So if you look at, say, Trump voting in the States, or voting people who vote for Trump and people who support the policies of Donald Trump around, say, immigration and around, say, isolationism and stuff like that, and those themes that run through the episode, the divide is along generational grounds. Young voters very much reject those, and older voters, by a slim but reasonable majority, accept them. Same thing happens with, say, Brexit in the in the United Kingdom, which is along similar lines, another sort of isolationist move, where you look at the breakdown in demographics there, where it's very much an older generation pushing for that and a younger generation pushing back against it. And again, I don't mean to generalize. There are old people who are vigorously opposed to these things and young people who enthusiastically support them. But broadly, if you look at it demographically, that is how it breaks down. And what I really, really, really appreciate about Picard, and one of the things that I absolutely love about it, is that it is at its core the story of a father who failed, or a father who was absent, or a father who did not live up to the responsibilities or keep the promises that he made, trying to do good on them, trying to make them right. And those speeches that he makes to the synths on Picard's behalf, he's not just arguing for them, he's also arguing for himself. And there's a wonderful line in there about, you know, how it's failure to consider an alternative is just failure of imagination. Or to say you have no choice is a failure of imagination. It's one of those true sort of Star Trek The Next Generation idealist values. It's the idea that you can imagine a better future than the one that's presented to you. Because again, that's one of the core themes of Picard, is the idea that the future that the Next Generation promised us, and I'm not talking about one with turbo lifts, I'm not talking about one with spaceships or people with pointed ears. The future that Star Trek promised us, which was like at the end of the Next Generation promised us, which was that at the end of the Cold War, when everything was stable, when the economy was booming, that mankind would enter this kind of, again, the unipolar moment, or the end of history or whatever, but that things would be better, things would be stable, things would be consistent, things would be reliable, people would be happy. And that future never materialized. And I think that one of the things that I really like about Picard is Picard grapples with that. It forces Picard to look at the fact the future that the Next Generation promised us, didn't actually happen. And so it's really great to see at the end of the season Picard make an argument that yes, maybe the future that we were promised, or the future that young people were promised by their parents, or the future that people who looked at the Next Generation expected for themselves, didn't materialize. But that doesn't give you an excuse to accept the way things are, or to stop imagining a better future. And I think that's a really powerful kind of sentiment. I think it's genuinely moving. I think obviously, putting it in the mouth of Patrick Stewart helps a great deal because he can sell that like nobody's business. I really like that aspect of the episode.
Picard struggled to find his voice in this season, and I mean that from actual a Picard character arc moment, because a lot of people will say that Picard's arc over the course of the season is an effective one. He goes from he's literally on death's door, is waiting to die, to being on La Sirena and saying engage and being reborn as such. And they mentioned it on the podcast, the actual Star Trek Picard podcast about being reborn. And I need to pick up on that in a minute. But he's gone through this kind of arc of that. But what I've really appreciated in aspects that I've got some worries about, but that he's tried to do this several times, but he hasn't been able to find his voice, and in this episode he does, and I think that's done really well. Even like last episode where he's saying, "I'll get the Federation, I'll be your man, I'll be your champion for this," and it's fallen on deaf ears, and what he's saying here, that you have got no choice, is a failure of imagination, and is don't turn into what they fear. Fear is a big part of the season, really. It's all about fear. It's all about these children, as it mentions on La Sirena, that it's the fear that they are childlike, that they are almost Data-like in a lot of ways, that it's just the way that they perceive things, and they don't know much different. They don't have this what Picard had. They don't have what we had in the past. We have this this idea of the utopia, or things are good. There's a lot of things that's hitting at us at the moment, which are quite bad, and this isolationism's kicked in, the Brexit thing, the Trump thing's all kind of rolling into one, and fear plays a big part into a lot of that, and I like where that's come in. What did you think to Picard's arc up until this point?
Well, again, like one of the things that I actually really, really liked Picard's arc over the course of the season. I was actually very, very, very fond of it. And again, part of this is down to not to talk too much about particular individual episodes. Absolute Candor I really adored, because Absolute Candor opens with, it has one of the best teasers of the season, which is Picard going to visit Elnor as a child, having believed that he's organised this evacuation of Romulus, and he's believed that he's done this final last great thing, and he's earned his right to rest. And it's amazing, because you can see in that moment, that is the Picard that if you'd ask somebody in 1994 when All Good Things aired, or 1995, like what you think Picard is going to be like in 2020, that teaser of Absolute Candor is exactly it. He's more relaxed, he's more comfortable, he's smiling a bit, but he's still authoritative, people are still listening to him, and he's still doing the right thing no matter what. And again, you had this big tension when Picard was announced, and when Stewart started doing press for it, when Chabon did press for it, and when they were saying that this is going to be a different sort of Picard. A lot of people being along the lines of, hashtag not my Picard, but rejecting the idea that Picard would be disillusioned or cynical or worn down or kind of beaten down in the way that he has been. And I really like that aspect, that Absolute Candor basically says, no, he was like that, then this moment happened and everything changed, and everything that he thought he had was kind of lost. And again, you can draw any number of parallels you want. People could compare that to the sensation. You hear people writing about, say, waking up the moment that they heard Brexit had actually gone through, the referendum had been passed, or people waking up the moment that they heard that Trump had been elected. Sort of like the sense that like this progressive wave of history, or this idea of kind of like history moving along an arc that bends towards justice, suddenly being upended and twisted, and everything being lost. And one of the things that I really like about Picard and its approach to Picard himself is that it allows him to be caught off guard by this, and he takes a break, he goes into retirement, he retreats from public life. And again, this is entirely in character. It's worth noting, by the way, the destruction of the Stargazer happened about a decade before he took command of the Enterprise, and implicitly he was absent during that time. He took that failure, despite the fact that he invented the Picard maneuver, saved as many lives as he did, and was generally regarded a hero. For Picard, he went away for a decade and licked his wounds before he came back and took charge of the Enterprise. And the same thing happens here. He took a big hit, he went away, and eventually found something that brought him back. And the thing that brought him back was children. And the thing that brought him back was the idea of his best friend's child needing his help, or children, twins, needing his assistance. And that inspired him to go back and to reconnect with his protege, and to reconnect with his children as well. And I think that like one of the things I really like about Picard is that it doesn't absolve him. it doesn't gloss over the fact that his failure to, or his giving up, his own surrendering, his own retreat was a kind of a failure, was something that deserves to be held to account. Like at several points over the season, people like Raffi or Elnor get angry at Picard, and justifiably so. And Stewart plays these sequences wonderfully, because you can see that in those moments Picard kind of agrees with them. Picard understands their criticisms are valid, and that part of what he's doing here is a mission of atonement. Again, he finds out he's going to die, and his first thing is, well, I need to do this thing. I need to make it right with Data. But if I'm going to make it right with Data, I'm also going to make it right with Elnor, the child I abandoned, on Vashti, and that sort of thing. Or I need to make it right with Raffi, who I just abandoned by resigning and leaving her with this huge mess to deal with that she was obviously not quite capable of doing, and anybody under circumstances would be incapable of handling, but I just threw it on her because I didn't want to do it anymore, and kind of feeling responsible and guilty for things like that. And I really like that aspect of kind of the season of Picard, because you do see him gradually coming back towards being a father figure, coming back towards taking responsibility, coming back towards accepting the responsibility that he has towards children. And again, this is one of the things that's interesting about it, because it fits as part of like a broader cultural thing with, say, The Last Jedi, which has a similar sort of arc for Luke Skywalker, who, again, he was a child of a different decade. He was a child of, say, the late 60s, 70s, where he was like going to embody the kind of, to throw off the kind of the oppression of his parents, to reject his parents' generation, and to kind of like create a better future. And Last Jedi is like, actually, you didn't create a better future, and you need to maybe answer for that, or not even answer for that, accept that and try to make it right. And I really like about Picard is that he does try to make it right over the course of the show, and particularly over the course of this episode in particular. Picard does everything that he can to make it right. And I think that's a hugely important arc, and I think it's very powerful, it's very emotive. I think it's exactly where the character needs to be, because that is the Picard that I kind of fell in love with on The Next Generation. It's the character that I know and love, is the man who tries to make things right. If that makes sense.
It does. And I always like a Star Wars quote on a Star Trek podcast.
I know.
Well done, my friend. Well done. I just wanted to briefly, because it is quite brief, discuss Sutra. And she is a lot of people was liken her to Law, or is this going to be the big bad? And she's kind of thrown off very, very quickly. What did you make to Sutra and the way she is portrayed in these two episodes, especially because obviously we only see her in the first one, but she's very quickly taken off, isn't she? Yeah. She's given a P45 very, very quickly, isn't she? So, what did you make to that?
A couple of things with Sutra that are interesting. First of all, I love the in-joke that they're all built off names that pun on Data and Lore. So Saga, for example, and Sutra, which is obviously a reference for an Indian word for a thread of text or stories brought together. So I quite like that. The second thing about Sutra that I really like is there's a sequence between her and Sung, which kind of gets at something that's interesting about, and again, I feel really pretentious that I call it the Goldsman era, but that's interesting about Star Trek in the Age of Discovery and Picard, right? Which is that traditionally we've seen science fiction as something very hard and very logical and very rational and very driven by facts and by, in terms of Star Trek, in terms of technobabble and exposition and stuff like that. And to be fair to Picard, it has some really great Star Trek technobabble. I absolutely love the sequence where Durante and Picard explain the Picard maneuver with the metaphor of, like a plane firing mirrors to distract radar. And it's very much like that sequence of Futurama where it's like, and like a balloon, and something bad happens, sort of stuff, with the simple analogy explaining the kind of underlying technobabble. But again, like a lot of classic Star Trek, or a lot of Berman-era Star Trek, is built around kind of the pseudo-rationality, technobabble, tachyons, neutrinos, scientific-sounding words thrown together in ways that don't really make sense, but they allow us to think that the logic of the show makes sense. What I like about Discovery, and about Picard in particular, is that they don't necessarily embrace that with the same eagerness or enthusiasm. And I mean, to pick a small example, Discovery is about a ship that's powered by magic mushrooms. But like even within this episode, you have the device that's given to Raffi and to Rios, which will repair the ship if they use their imagination. And again, you get a sequence later on where Jurati explains using technobabble how this actually works, though that's complete nonsense, like most other technobabble in Star Trek. But I kind of like that the episode is like, no, it's basically, it's an inversion of Arthur C. Clarke's law. It's sufficiently advanced technology. Trust us on that and let the plot work in the way that it needs to.
Yeah, I also feel it's playing on that though a little bit, isn't it? It's because that whole Jurati scene is playing on the Star Trek core. You mentioned the Picard maneuver. You mentioned, the bits and bobs. Even like the Voyage. It's mentioned in Voyage. I can't remember the episode now where they do that hologram thing.
Yeah.
With the ships, but they're kind of playing around a little bit. Now I do have an issue with the way they use Make It So, and the couple of other bits that she does. But overall, that's kind of where they're playing, as you say, with the technobabble. They don't really use it. It's like they don't use star dates either. They purposely not use star dates. And I think that they're fully aware of how and why they're doing that, which I do appreciate. I absolutely love that scene when there's 100 faces of Jurati.
Yes, and
when she turns around.
What's really great about that sequence with the 100 faces of Alison Pill is that you just know that there are people on YouTube who are so angry at it, even though it's amazing. Like, it's both amazing of itself and also is going to make people who are very sensitive about such things really inexplicably angry. And I kind of adore that aspect of it. Also, Alison Pill is amazing. I don't know if we're going to talk about individual people here, but Jurati is probably my breakout my breakout new character from the show. And I think that there are some issues with the way that the whole episode glosses over the fact that she murdered her mentor and lover. But aside from that, Jurati's just an amazing character, in large part because Pill has this wonderful kind of comic timing and chemistry with just about every other member of the ensemble, which is very rare. Because again, when you're doing the first season of the show, a large part of it is about rotating actors until you find out who has chemistry together, and basically by the end of the season you start sticking them together with more frequency. That's why I suspect you start seeing more of Raffi and Rios towards the end of the season, because they figured that kind of Hurd and the actor playing Rios work really well together, and so forth, give them more scenes. But again, Pill is just really phenomenal. That sequence, like the sequence where she breaks Picard out and she's like, I thought I'd be the world's worst spy, but it turns out I may have a gift for it. Or also the bit where Picard is kind of, where she's asking a question, she's like, are you not answering to build suspense? And he's like, I'm busy. I'm very busy. We're in the middle of a busy situation here. And it's really great. I really love that. But sorry, back to Sutra. I'm going to jump ahead again. Go. Because the one question I have on that scene where he's really concentrating on driving the ship is, what happened to the holograms? Where did Emmett disappear to? Because Emmett's like the tactical officer. Surely the hologram Emmett, who's the weapons specialist, I think that's Emmett anyway. Yeah. He doesn't think to call them. That would be good. But yeah, no, carry on. Sorry, that's me jumping in. It dawned on me on the second watch then what's happened to the holograms. But, there's a couple of moments like that as well. Like there's the moment where, for example, and again we're jumping ahead and jumping all over the place. I promise I'll get back to Sutra in a moment. But the sequence where like Narek's cunning plan to infiltrate the synth village, which consists of like walking up to the gates, presenting him as a prisoner, and counting on the synths just taking their weapons but letting them just wander around the city freely by themselves, which seems a bit unusual given that they've taken Picard into custody. It feels like the thing that they do when a bunch of strangers show up at their gate while they're about to open a gate and summon, like, H.P. Lovecraft's nightmares, but this time made of metal, into the realm of mortals, would be, maybe we should lock them all up just for a moment, give them a second, yeah? Then we can let them out afterwards, or let them all be like vaporized or turn into goo or whatever's going to happen during, and I love the phrase biocidal event. Biocidal event is my new favorite technobabble term. Again, there's a lot of that kind of illogicality kind of at work in the episode. A lot of sense of like, we need to get to this point very, very quickly. And so as a result, we kind of jump over kind of a number of logical leaps to get there. It's ironic that, we're talking about a Star Trek episode that maybe doesn't have enough exposition in it. And it's certainly kind of like an approach that is unique to, say, Discovery and Picard. And I mean, maybe it will be irritating in a couple of seasons. But for now, I'm kind of willing to forgive it because it's a little bit pacey and I can go with it. And it kind of to tie that back then, and look, watch how I do this. This is veteran podcasting right here. So one of the things that I really like about that sequence where Narek leads the expedition into to attack the transmitter in the synth village, basically, and this ties into the stuff I saw about Sutra a moment ago, is that Picard basically builds up this idea of there being a big action sequence that will save the day, of there being like action adventure and shooting and phasers and explosions. And again, that's one of the criticisms that you hear a lot of Discovery era or Picard era Star Trek from people who are like not my Star Trek or whatever, people who are very traditional in their Star Trek tastes and people who are maybe a bit more cynical about the newer iteration of the franchise. And everybody always has been cynical about the new iterations of Star Trek. And that's understandable and fair. And I think when the dust settles, we'll see how things lie. But I think one of the things that you see is people criticizing Discovery and Picard for being action-oriented. And they are, but criticizing them for being action-oriented to the exclusion of everything else. One of the things I quite like about the structure of this finale is that you get the big action set piece where Rios and Narek mastermind this attempt to dismantle the transmitter, blow it up, and to stop whatever's coming through, and it backfires spectacularly. Like it catastrophically backfires for everybody involved, because what it ends up doing is it ends up radicalizing Soji. It convinces Soji that she needs to keep the transmitter open, that she can't trust people, and that the only thing to do is to let whatever's on the other side of that come through. And so you have this idea that violence, and even violence perpetrated by heroes for the purpose of like saving all organic life in the universe, but violence solves nothing. Or violence, if it's executed without, compassion, without skill, and without craft, and without a greater objective, is ultimately self-defeating. So you have this idea that somehow Rios and Narek, while trying to save the universe, have made things even worse, which is a really nice twist, because that means that the episode hinges on that big Picard speech that he gives. But very quickly about Sutra, and to tie back to Sutra, that kind of thing that I really like is that moment where she's talking with Sung, and, she's saying, I'm glad you admire my reason, or that you understand my reason for what I did. You have Sung basically saying, reason isn't everything. Reason isn't the heart of everything. And this is one of those big themes, and again, inverted commas, themes of kind of Discovery and Picard. And it's one of the things that I really like about them, and I think works really well. And I think that maybe, I understand that other people don't like as much as I do, and I understand that I think it's maybe more of a sticking point for certain Star Trek fans than, it's one of those things that people don't really articulate that much, but I think is a problem for some fans. And it's tied to that technobabble thing. It's the moving away from strict rationality and exposition-driven kind of characterization and plotting towards a more emotive style of narrative, an emotive style of storytelling. Yeah. This is most obvious in the first season of Discovery, where Michael's entire arc is that she needs to stop pretending to be rational. She needs to stop burying her emotions under rationality, because all rationality does is disguise those emotions and cause them to manifest themselves in ways that are counterproductive and destructive. She needs to accept who she is and how she feels about things is just as rational as how things actually are. And you have that kind of playing out throughout. That's what leads her to the mutiny, for example, where she refuses to accept that she's traumatized by the memory of the Klingon attack that killed her parents. And so she rationalizes this mutiny that she has, which basically gets everybody killed and leads to this horrific kind of consequence and starts a whole war, because she can't make sense of her feelings, because she has to hide them, because she's been taught to repress them. And basically the big arc of Discovery and of Picard is about learning to trust your feelings and to understand that feelings and emotions and sensitivities are just as important as kind of raw, rational kind of approaches to the universe. Strict rationality can be very cold, can be mechanical, and can lead you to terrible, terrible decisions. And you have that there with Sutra, who is very much a character who is defined by rationality, who is defined by her internal logic, who is defined by the processes and decisions that she's made. And those processes, as Sung points out, lead to the outcome that she desires. She accomplishes her goal. She murders Saga, and that therefore stirs the synths up into opening the gate, which is what she wanted all along. But as Sung points out, the apply of cold rationality without any moral conscience behind it, without any moral imperative, is empty. And I really like that aspect of it, and it's nice to see that coming into Star Trek. I think it's good to see that Picard and even Discovery foregrounding that to the extent that they have, and I think that's kind of important and worthy of doing.
With what you're saying there, with the logical reasoning or the very kind of strict rationale for things, is something that I've probably had issues with along the way. If it's done in a way like Seven, for example, in Voyager, where that's where she's come from, that she's learning to develop the way that she is, and obviously Sutra's a microcosm of what that is, then I completely get behind it. But sometimes storytelling can be a bit too much like that as well.
Fair, yeah.
So the narrative can be a bit too solid, and if that emotional impact, which is why when we get later into the episode, it's there's a big change in there. But the one thing I wanted to touch on, just from a different angle regarding the Sutra and Sung thing, is that Amy Nelson talked about this in last week's episode about Brent Spiner being in this episode, but as Brent Spiner, or potentially what we're saying with like Brent Spiner and Patrick Stewart is that they're becoming closer and closer to the characters that they're playing. And in the history of the Sungs, they've pretty much had they've been quite mad scientists, as was mentioned last time, where this version of Sung, the brother, may drive people crazy, because where's that come from? But but it's obviously a kind of a Brent Spiner kind of aspect that he's played so many mad scientists, or like the eugenic stuff that he did in Enterprise, and there's that as well. But I'm thinking more of like stuff that he's played in Enterprise as a Sung, where this one it takes you down a path which you kind of have a feeling it's not going to go down. He's defending them. He's almost the father of them, along with Maddox, and he's siding with them, and Picard's being locked up. But then in one comment, it's quickly changed around, and he sees what Sutra has done. He's trying to teach them the right things. He's trying to, and it goes back to your emotional aspect of it. He's trying to be the beacon for them. Reason is everything is what he says, like he said, and. I thought that I taught you better. That he's trying to teach these people this life, which what we're basically talking about is the synthetics being recognised as life, and as I say, Measure of the Man, for example. But the Sung character is interesting from that regard. I mean, what did you think to that? Do you think that is a major plot point in that it was a kind of a Brent Spiner kind of ideal? That he's playing something that's different to what he's done before.
Well, I mean, again, the thing with the Sung character that's kind of interesting. Again, this is another, not to draw too many patterns between like Discovery and Picard, where you have a kind of a human relative to an alien character, which is interesting because you obviously have sort of like Michael Burnham being Spock's sister, for example, but you have Sung being basically Data's brother, despite the fact that he's flesh and blood and Data, has a positronic matrix. It's kind of an interesting kind of blurring of the lines between the two, which I really like, and I think sort of updates the franchise. If you're being cynical, you could say that it's like, the Fast and Furious. It's about family, and the idea of found family. But I actually really think there's something very important about it. And again, in terms of like diversity, in terms of representation, but in terms of like an idea that, you can have a family that is composed of people who are quite literally not made of the same stuff, but who still consider themselves brothers. I actually love at the end of the episode that Data, while he's in that space with Picard, the kind of quantum limbo, he talks about his brother. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't qualify. Yeah. He's my brother, which I absolutely adore. I love the idea that even though they're flesh and blood, even though they're different, they're made of literally different elements, they're still family to one another. And I actually quite like that about it. And I also do think that, the Arik Sung stuff is fantastic as a get-out-of-jail-free card in terms of casting Brent Spiner as a hidden relative of Mooney and Sung. Because it's like, Enterprise did it. There's precedent. We can get away with it. Join us next week where Worf will be playing, where Michael Dorn will be playing Worf's twin brother. But yes, it kind of, in terms of the mad scientist stuff, a lot of that does feel a little bit rushed. Again, it's like the XB stuff. There's a sense of almost missing a step between it, because again, Sung sees the footage of the murder of Saga, and he immediately realizes what's happening. He pops up behind Rios during his mission. He's like, yep, you would think that, wouldn't you, or whatever, and basically kind of guides them into the center of the city. And then it looks like he's going to betray them, but he doesn't. He actually makes a moral choice. It all plays very, very quickly, but I do think there is something. You're entirely right there about kind of subverting how you expect that to go, because you do expect the mad scientist to basically be all for his creations no matter what, or to choose, because he has chosen, his creations over all living life in the universe, even though he's planning to transfer himself into the Golem at that point. And there's a certain sense at which like his moral transformation is a little bit rushed. Again, it's like Jurati in terms of there's a sense of there being no real reckoning for kind of what he's done. Because even though he does change sides at the end, there's a still sense of, well, you were kind of helping organize Biocide at one point, right? And there was kind of like a sense of being party to all that. That's never really dealt with or never really explored outside of Picard saying, I don't really care for him that much. Which is like, okay, fine, that's maybe punishment enough in the grand scheme of things. It does feel a little bit rushed, even if I did appreciate the kind of nice twist of him not being entirely amoral, of him actually taking his responsibilities as a parent kind of seriously. And again, this is one of those things where you mentioned that, yes, the emotional storytelling can lead to kind of like a looser plotting and can lead to plot holes, and that's entirely fair. And generally what I find is I personally, and again, this is just me personally, I'm not speaking for everybody, I'm not making an objective statement or anything like that, but personally I find I can forgive a lot if it's thematically consistent. And it is thematically consistent because of what you mentioned, which is this is a story about parents taking responsibility for their children and taking responsibility for the worlds in which their children find themselves and how their children turn out to live. And him making that switch from mad scientist to disappointed father works thematically, which means I can get behind it as a character beat, even if it comes out of nowhere in terms of plot. And it's one of those just about cases where it's like, don't push your luck here, but I can forgive a lot because of that.
Yeah. I'm going to be flippant now. Narek, where's he gone? First off. And two, but more seriously, Narek comes into this. I mentioned him at the top of the episode that he goes off on his own little quest, and he goes back to La Serena, throws the rocks. At which point Rios says something like, "I've heard this noise before," which was quite strange. But anyway, but yeah. So the Rios Raffi little segment there was quite nice. I like that they've kind of come full circle now. They've found the characters within themselves. You mentioned that earlier, actually. That's in my notes there as well. But that the characters themselves seem to be locked in the right chemistry now, and I really enjoy their little to and fro there.
And again, you have that kind of like that pays off. The mention, like Picard talked about, to say you have no choice is a failure of imagination. And then you cut to Rios and Raffi literally fixing the ship with nothing but the power of their imagination. You know, you have to imagine the fix, see the hole patching itself. What's happening, nothing that makes any sense. And again, if you want to be strict in terms of plot terms, this is all just arbitrary nonsense. But in terms of theme, you're like, yep, I see what the episode's doing here. It makes sense. This is a story about like imagining a better world. So therefore, there's literally a device that allows the characters to imagine a better world and to imagine how things were if they could fix things and literally use the power of their mind's eye or their imagination to fix things. And it's like, yep, okay, you get a pass on that one too. Well played.
But Narek's the levity that we get with Narek throwing rocks at a spaceship was quite nice.
I really like.
I've got these grenades in my bag.
I'm throwing rocks, which might be his best line of the season. It's on a short contender of being one of the best lines of the season, but it's certainly Narek's best line of the season. I've got these grenades and I'm throwing rocks, which is just perfect. And again, Narek's sorry, go for it there.
No, it's okay. I was going to just briefly talk about Narek because I know that Tony doesn't. He has quite a strong opinion about Narek and Narissa, and I agree with Narissa, and we'll talk about Narissa shortly. But Narek, I have less of a problem with. I think that he's definitely going to be someone that will come back. He'll be one of those people that will. If depending on how they use him, he could be one of those people that just pops up now and again and is a foil or a friend or a foe all times. He can flip between the two. I think that will work quite well from that aspect. But he just randomly disappears at the end of the episode. I don't know any idea what's happening with him. But I think he's a decent enough character that they could use him quite well in season 2. But he's used here with a bit of levity and the soldier plot line, apart from the walk going down the corridors, which is probably the worst thing I've ever seen ever. But in this one, when he's retelling the story, you mentioned about pop culture, he mentions Ragnarok and Judgment Day, which are two big pop culture things. But I wanted to ask you the question about this mythos of the Gamadan story, which has been retold back from a few episodes ago as well. That this kind of really kind of focuses in on what that story is, and he even mentions the fact that it's history, but it's about history repeating itself again. And this is a theme that's throughout this episode, with Picard's rebirth and this story that's coming through, that, you know, it's Soji had this choice. She had the choice to become the destroyer or not. But there is this cyclical thing which is coming around in the episode quite strongly. What did you make of that campfire scene with Narek, and what do you make of Narek overall? What are your opinions? Are they strong? Can you see him developing better? Or do you absolutely hate him, as what Tony seems to do?
I absolutely love that Raffi immediately introduces him as the dirtbag Romulan boyfriend. It's like, yes, that's actually the perfect summary of who Narek is as a character right now. And actually, Narek's interesting because at the start of the season, I really couldn't stand him. He was like transparently there to serve a plot function and there to play a role, and he was going to be a driving force for exposition around Soji, and he was mostly going to be a way of kind of keeping our wheels spinning for a couple of episodes while we wait for Soji to join up with the cast that we actually care about, which is Picard. And so, you know, I was immediately primed not to like Narek, despite the fact that I actually really like Harry Treadway. He's really great in Penny Dreadful, actually. If people are looking for something to watch while they're quarantined, I'd wholeheartedly recommend Penny Dreadful. But what happened over the course of the season, which I didn't expect to happen, but I'm really glad that it did, it's one of those rare things that happens in television writing, where it's almost like you have a character summary and plot description, and that only gets you halfway through the season. And you get halfway through the season, you're like, oh crap, this character is still around, this actor's still getting paid, we need to find a way to slot him into the remaining 5 episodes. And so Narek basically wanders through a humiliation conga line for the final 5 episodes of the season, where he's just kind of lost and adrift, and he doesn't really have an anchoring plot line or purpose. And I really like that. I kind of find myself, it can work really well or it can work really badly. A bad example of it is, say, Kim Bauer on the second season of 24.
Yeah, 24.
Famously menaced by a mountain lion or a cougar, like at one stage during the show's run, or kind of kidnapped by, is it Kevin Dillon, and locked in an underground shelter at one point because they have no idea what they're doing with her. I think Narek kind of works, A, because the season is short, it's only 10 episodes, so he's only ever lost for a couple of episodes at a time. B, Harry Treadway is actually really, really good, and I kind of like seeing him and stuff. And he has this kind of vibe to him where he manages to come across as both incredibly arrogant and also incredibly, like, suffering. He always seems like he's having a deeply unpleasant time no matter what he's doing, which is a great combination in an actor. Somebody who is smug and suffering at the same time, which I really like. And even kind of here, he gets those wonderful kind of small lines, like that sequence where it's a grenade and I'm throwing rocks. And he also gets that sequence, which is one of the highlights of the season for me, and it's the one that you mentioned, it's the lore sequence. And again, the reason why I really like that, and again, it's that thing that you mentioned about it being cyclical. He thinks it's history. You know, it's history rather than prophecy. And again, this is something that's very old, very traditional. People talk about the Book of Revelation, where the Book of Revelation is, you know, by some accounts, a prophecy of how the world is going to end. By other accounts, it's actually an account of the persecution of the Christians by the Romans that was told in code in order to disguise it and prevent censorship of it. So is it history or is it future? Is it past, present, or future? And is there a difference between the three? And I really like that aspect of it. What I adore about the sequence with, it's Gamarung, is that what it's called? Gamadan. That's great, because that again feels like a contraction of Götterdämmerung, the kind of like the ring cycle, the end of, you know, sort of that sort of apocryphal myth. But again, what I really like about that is that it does something that Picard does a great deal over the course of its season, which is it taps into this almost 60s sensibility. If, like, the first season of Picard, people have been complaining because it doesn't feel like a lot of classic Next Generation, and they're probably right. It has a very different texture to it. What it does have, which is interesting, is a lot of connection to the first season of The Next Generation, which is not what anybody thinks about when they think about the show. And I'm thinking about things like, for example, the Borg and the Romulans, which is basically the plot of The Neutral Zone, to pick an example, or the use of extreme gore, which is from Conspiracy, which is another first season episode, to pick another example. But it also kind of ties back to the first season of the original Star Trek and its portrayal of the universe, of the Star Trek universe, which was more arbitrary, more random, more chaotic, and less structured cultured than the universe that we take for granted. And the thing that I like about the sequence where they're discussing the apocalypse and the end of the world here is that it feels very much like it taps into those 60s anxieties of the original, like the first season or first and second season of Star Trek. So like when he talks about the idea of there being madness raining down or a crack in the skin of the universe, or there being something monstrous lurking beyond our explanation, that's something that recalls, well, first of all, the work of Robert Bloch, who worked on Star Trek and was a protege of H.P. Lovecraft, who gave us one of the first Android stories with What Are Little Girls Made Of, which explicitly references Lovecraft and the old ones as having designed these androids. But like outside of that, even things like, say, the Kelvins, which are aliens that are so monstrous that they have to take human form and come from beyond our galaxy, or even the alien from the Medusans from what's it called? Is There in Truth No Beauty? Which are like aliens that are so strange that to look upon them is to drive yourself mad, for example. And there's that sort of sense running through. But even say the apocalypticism of, or the sense of madness as something contagious that spreads across the universe. Think about it in, say, The Naked Time, early in the first season, where the crew are basically driven mad by this kind of virus that turns out to be water. But basically they're driven around the bend. The scenes of kind of, Sulu running around shirtless, for example. Think about the wave of madness that is spreading across the cosmos in Operation Annihilate, where it's charting its course through the Federation. There's like madness sweeping across the universe. Think about Spock's kind of psychic experience in The Immunity Syndrome, where he literally hears the death howls of hundreds of Vulcans light years away through the void of space. Or even to pick another, and I promise it'll be the last example, say Red Hour in Return of the Archons, which is basically a normal society where 1 hour every day all the laws are suspended and it descends into anarchy and chaos. And again, there's a real sense of that running through Picard in general and that prophecy as a whole. And it's this sense of the universe as a chaotic, arbitrary place, which isn't something that we associate with Berman era Star Trek in any way, shape, or form, but is something that I associate with kind of 60s era Star Trek. And it's a nice bookend to it because it ties into, and I think this is deliberate. And I'll talk about why I think it's deliberate in a moment, but it ties into kind of other themes that are running through the show. This idea of generational conflict, this idea of parents and children at odds with one another. And again, like Narek mentions this idea of it being history repeating and a cycle repeating, and it's both past and its future. And again, you see that in articles that are written about, say, 2016, which, the 2016 election being compared to 1968, civil unrest being compared to the civil unrest of the late 60s. All these kind of articles and talking points that come out that say that, the sense of there being a society on the edge of a revolution, which is a mood that is very similar to what you had in the late 60s, a kind of ambience that's soaking through popular culture. And the reason why I think this might be intentional, and it's something that I really like about the episode, the orchids, the space orchids, the giant space orchids that attack Romulan ships, which are, first of all, wonderfully weird imagery for a Star Trek show. And I kind of adore them on those terms alone. But they also seem like they might possibly be referencing, and again, given the themes of the episode, I think it's very deliberate, though that famous shot from the March on the Pentagon, where the soldiers standing with guns and the children walk up to the guns and put flowers in them. And again, it's very iconic. I mean, Zack Snyder's Watchmen kind of puts it in his opening credits, to pick an example. The Simpsons have done it quite a few times over the course of their run, to pick another example. But you have the Romulans kind of staring down the planet. And by the way, I absolutely love that the Romulans apparently have 5 different plans for, like, genocide. She's like, yes, planetary bombardment sequence number 5, because I'm not feeling 4 this morning. I kind of wonder what they were using, and was it improbable cause? Like, that was the problem. That's why the Jem'Hadar were able to ambush them, because Tane was like, no, I think 3 today. I think 3. I'm feeling 3 today. But you have the sequence where these flowers just go up into space and meet these Romulan armada. And you have this kind of, again, it's very literally flowers in the face of guns, and youth culture in the face of kind of skepticism and paranoia of youth culture, and the two of them coming together. And I think they work rather well. And I think that Narek's apocalypticism, or sort of like, sort of end of the world kind of philosophy, is a large part of that, because it does tap into something that is kind of feels like it's happening at the moment. I mean, obviously it feels, as we're talking about it now, hunkered down in our homes during the middle of the coronavirus crisis. But I think even beyond that, there's a general sense of kind of dread and anxiety running through the modern world that people have very strongly connected to the kind of 60s, to the height of the Cold War, but even more specifically to like the cultural conflict, the kind of cultural revolution that was taking place like in the late 60s as well. And I think that connection is intentional, and I think it's strong.
Absolutely. The one thing I will say about the fight, we're going to get into the fight very shortly, but is it called me instantly back to Space Invaders, because the way that they warp in, the Romulans especially, it just instantly was like, oh, I'm going to play Space Invaders now. So that's where my mind went when they.
I love the planetary bombardment number 5 is Space Invaders.
Yeah, exactly.
That's it. Like planetary bombardment number 3 is like asteroids.
Yeah, maybe, because asteroids is not as formulaic, is it? It's more random.
Yeah.
So that maybe that's what it is. Asteroids is number 3. Yeah, definitely. I'll go with that. But yeah, so Narek then disappears. I don't think he appears again, does he? I think that's it. I think that's the only section he's in. Oh yeah. So he tells a story, then they go into they actually get village, to the actual village, don't they? But no, I mean, if we just pick on something just before we get to the major fight scene, and then as we head into the final sort of half an hour or so, the two people that we haven't really discussed yet are Narissa and Seven, and especially their fight scene. What did you make to that, and what did you make to Narissa's downfall, and how Narissa's been played out through the season? I think that we've talked about Peyton List as an actress on the show quite a lot, but what did you make to her portrayal of her and what she was given for that character?
Yeah, Narissa feels very much, again, like Narek is a character who was designed to serve a function and to kind of keep wheels spinning in the first half of the season while you're waiting for Soji to meet up with Picard.
Yeah.
And while Narek has, through some fluke and perhaps through Harry Treadway's kind of like, combination of insufferableness and smugitude, managed to kind of like make something of that, Narissa feels like she's very much adrift of that. And you kind of get that here where she's, not even a secondary boss, really. She's there, she's dispatched by a special guest star. She's just thrown to her death. Like, she's targeting weapons into space when that happens. You could very easily have cut that entire subplot, and the plot of the episode would unfold kind of exactly as it was going. It's in no way kind of integral to the story being told, which is just a little bit of a shame. It does feel like a little bit of a disappointment, and you kind of see that almost in the way that they work very quickly to distance Narek from Narissa. There's a sense almost of the writers kind of wanting to cut that particular cord, or wanting to cut that tether that connects them, because it's like where Elnor's like, well, she killed you, and your sister killed you, and it's like, well, it's a good thing she's not here then, and it's like, well, that's that then, I guess. That's the end of that relationship. But it does feel very much like she's surplus to requirements, and maybe the time to get rid of her would have been a couple of episodes ago rather than to bring her into the finale. Although, again, there's a sense in terms of plot mechanics, she does give Seven something to do during the climax. Although I do wonder if, like, Jerry Ryan, I'm really happy to see Jerry Ryan, and I actually think there's some really good stuff for Jerry Ryan in here. But I do think that, like, she's a guest star in the episode. You could get away with her just being there with Elnor at the start and getting a big beat at the climax. Getting a big beat after the climax. She doesn't need to be doing something during the action beats at the climax. So you could almost get away with just leaving that stuff out entirely, I think. Which is and also Seven has already done her big murder revenge plot for the season. There is a sense of redundancy to her killing of Narissa in order to avenge Hugh. Particularly given that, like, Seven and Hugh, we don't really have that sense of kind of a strong relationship between them, I think, in order to justify it in the same way that we do with, say, Icheb, which happened earlier in the season as well. So there's a sense of kind of that not necessarily smoothing over in the way that the episode needs it to, at least in my eyes.
Yeah, it's alluded to, isn't it, that they have had the past between them, because he's got the token for Seven to be called, but it's more of a plot device than anything else. And I'm sure that the supplemental stuff that will probably dive into Hugh and Seven, because they are two love characters, and I think there will definitely be something along those lines that they will look into, because Especially with the reaction to Hugh's death as well. There was quite a strong reaction to that. But I get it.
You never know.
I always think, the nanoprobes and nanobots can do a lot of things. So there's always a potential for him to come back. But we get to the main crux of what you would expect in these type of TV shows, that you get to a space battle. We've already mentioned the Space Invader section and the fight scene with the orchids that are coming up, and the fact that Picard could have potentially called the holograms but doesn't. So we get this kind of dogfight that's happening. But in the midst of all that, we kind of feel we get a turning point where Picard is. And I'm going to mention this more in the season review about what his syndrome is and how it plays out through the season. But in this particular episode, it hits real hard that it's getting worse, and he's going to hasten the inevitable, which is what is said when he's injected with polysephnephrine. Yes, I did have to write that down. But yeah, so he does have that. What did you? And then obviously the spaceships, the Starfleet arrive. The fleet seems to be a lot of ships, but a lot of the same type of ships. So I can only imagine they've got a factory worth of new ships. Now, I could potentially put a narrative in that since the Mars attack, that there's been issues, and that this is now the new fleet armada that's only just been built. I can get away with that, I think, in my head canon. But what did you make to this then, and the kind of contrivance that Picard's things that are hitting him really hard right at the time when he's needed the most, and then feel free to talk into the speech that he gives on the open channel, which is the very Next Generation, and where we end up at the end of the fight scene. So what did you think to all of that?
Well, okay, a couple of things very quickly. Yes, the syndrome attack was very, very convenient, but again, that's one of those things that you kind of allow in terms of plotting. It's very much that Chekhov's gun. It's been on the mantelpiece, and it's going to go off at the worst possible moment. Has it been seeded as thoroughly as one might like? Maybe not. It would have been nice to maybe have a few indications in a couple of earlier episodes that were perhaps a bit stronger than what we've had. Now, I mean, you've obviously had him tell the crew that he has the condition. You've had the news that it's worsening, and it has been kind of laid out, and it's been dutifully set up, but it doesn't feel like it's been kind of properly alluded to. It doesn't feel like it's necessarily kind of been made inevitable in the way that it probably needs to be for the beat to work as well as it could. But I think it works. I think it's fair enough that you understand that the logic of the story means that you get to the climax and all the guns are going to go off at once, because there's no point in Picard being or having that illness if that illness doesn't raise its head at the worst possible moment in terms of storytelling. So I kind of forgive it for that. The Big Picard speech is great. Like, I legitimately love the Big Picard speech. And again, it's one of those things where if you were being cynical, you'd say, oh, well, they had to include a giant space battle in order to keep people interested, because that's what people watch these days. Why can't they just bring back the Next Generation where people talk around a table? And you could, if you were being cynical, say that. I tend to look at it a bit more optimistic. I quite like the idea of Picard looking like it's going to give you a generic space battle action sequence akin to something from, and we mentioned Star Wars a couple of times here, but say Star Wars, for example, where there's a lot of diving, a lot of whirling, a lot of really great camera work, some wonderful special effects work. And again, we'll talk about the models in a second, or talk about the kind of, the copy and paste effect in a second. But generally speaking, the special effects here are pretty good, pretty darn good. And I like the idea of kind of setting up the idea that it is going to be an action resolution, and then saying, no, it's just going to be two people talking to one another. And again, you have that sense of Lovecraftian horror. You have the metal tentacles waiting to come through the hole in the sky, which again is another pop culture reference. Another thing, like, if the Borg cube is the crashed, Death Star from the trailer to Rise of Skywalker, this is the hole in the sky over, New York in the Avengers movies, or any number of other movies. Yeah, that sort of thing. And again, that tapping into anxiety. I think there's a connection between that and, say, 9/11, for example, a hole or a tear in the sky as well, through which madness comes. But that's a completely different discussion to have. But I do think that, it's nice that the whole thing comes down to Picard making an appeal to Soji's better nature and her responding to that, and it basically ending because of that. I do have a couple of issues with the sudden arrival of Starfleet at the end. I don't mind the copy and paste starships. Partly because it's a logistical and production reality in terms of, think about how long it took the Star Trek series to build up new ships. Star Trek The Next Generation inherited stuff like the Excelsior class, the Miranda class from the movies where they had the budget to make the models.
Yeah.
When they moved past models into CGI, Deep Space Nine only gradually kind of rolled out new classes like, say, the Akira class and the Saber class, most of which I believe were modeled for First Contact as well, where you have the budget to do that. So I completely understand that they didn't have the budget to model that many new classes for this. It is interesting in terms of, like, again, people have talked about the models for those Deep Space Nine ships being available in high definition on your computer software. So I wonder, like, maybe somewhere in the back of the shots there is kind of an Akira or a Saber class ship in high definition rendered. But again, at that stage, it's what, 20 years old? Although I suppose the Excelsior class and the Miranda class were kept around for 100 years because they just happened to be what the production team had available in storage when they were shooting The Next Generation. More to the point, though, I think the sudden arrival of Starfleet at the end isn't entirely earned, dramatically speaking. And I think, you know, again, this is one of those things where you see Will again and it feels great, but it's like he was retired, you know, on a planet with his wife maybe a couple of days ago. How was he able to manage to wrangle his way not only to, you know, presumably get a whole fleet together, but also get himself in charge of the fleet and also get himself in charge of that particular ship, presumably like dislocating the commanding officer whose job it was to be in charge of that ship. And there's a whole sense of like that needing to be a story that maybe needs to be set up off screen, but also, and this is something that I feel like I am more skeptical of than most Star Trek fans, and something that I suspect a lot of people listening to the podcast might disagree with me about. And that's entirely fair, to be absolutely clear. But one of my issues with Picard, and I mentioned this earlier, the lack of follow-through of its strongest ideas. And one of the more interesting ideas in Picard is the idea that the Federation has basically become more isolationist and introverted and withdrawn. And again, that's because the Federation has always been a mirror of the United States. It's always been an idealized depiction of the United States. You know, it's reflected Kennedy-era New Frontier optimism in the 60s. It reflected this idea of the world's policeman during the era of, you know, the New World Order of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in the 90s. And it kind of, even in Enterprise, it represented this kind of fear of the unknown, anxiety and uncertainty about how the rest of the universe looks at us in Enterprise. And so you have kind of this sense of, like, in Picard, it representing or mirroring America as it is now, and that being something that is radically different from what anybody watching The Next Generation in the Bush or Clinton, the Bush 1 or Clinton eras would have thought that it was. And so you have basically that aspect of the show I really like, but over the course of the show, you have them weakening and whittling away at that. You have the Romulan plot, the reveal that Commodore O is secretly a Romulan double operative, and she's been driving the Federation towards isolationism. You have the idea that the synth attack was driven by the Romulans, and that itself also means that kind of the isolation isn't the Federation's fault. Now, to be fair, Chabon is a good writer, and he understands how this works, and he's very careful to have given Picard and Rios a scene. I don't know whether it's in part 1 or the episode before part 1, but where they sit down and Picard says, no, the Federation still failed. The Federation still didn't live up to its responsibilities. It's still reasonable to be angry at the Federation, even though they were manipulated by outside forces. But there's a sense of Picard kind of absolving the Federation of a lot of these. And that's my issue with the arrival of the fleet at the end of the episode, is that it absolves the Federation and Starfleet of its complete indifference to the Romulan refugee crisis, its suppression of synthetic life forms, with just nothing more than a hand wave. It feels like it's unearned dramatically to me. It feels like it exists largely so that it can have a inverted commas Star Trek moment, where we can do a moment at the end of the season where Starfleet is actually restored to its original value and has become the institution that we always hoped it was and always wanted it to be, and the institution that a lot of people who are angry at the basic premise of Picard, a lot of people got very defensive at the idea that Picard would deal with these themes, you know, wanted Star Trek to be this bastion of optimism and hope. And it feels like the episode doesn't quite get there in explaining how Starfleet moved beyond kind of that fear, that paranoia, that uncertainty. It doesn't explain how Picard, or Riker even, managed to convince them so quickly to invest so much in this particular conflict. And again, maybe that's rushed pacing, but it also feels like it's a bit of a kind of a cop-out, because I can see why it's there. I can see what purpose it serves thematically. Again, Picard is redeeming himself as a father to Elnor, and to, Raffi. The Federation are redeeming themselves as parents to the synths on the planet below in their protection. But it doesn't feel like I've watched Picard go through the journey over the course of these 10 episodes to becoming the father figure that he failed to be to Elnor in the past, or to Raffi in the past, or that Rios lost in the past. I've watched that happen over the course of 10 episodes. I've seen it grow and develop. I've seen it pay off, and that payoff is here. I have not seen the Federation or Starfleet change or develop over the course of those episodes. They've been entirely absent. The entire point of the show is that Starfleet has been entirely absent. And it doesn't feel earned that they show up as the cavalry at the last minute. As much fun as it is to see Riker, even though I do think at his age, Riker would have a great deal more difficulty executing the Riker maneuver than Picard has executing the Picard maneuver.
One of the aspects that I've heard over the last weeks is, it's not Star Trek because Starfleet aren't in it, but we're seeing a different aspect of what the universe is, and I really like that. I like the idea that we're seeing a different aspect to Starfleet. The issue that I have, it's very similar to what you're saying about but mine's more from an in-world view, that they went through the Dominion War. They have had this synths that attacked Mars, they attacked the fleet. Shipbuilding became an issue, that they've become isolationists, that they've become within themselves, yet they managed to find themselves a fleet that quickly, that readily, and that available. I mean, if you were listening to last week, that I went off to arrest Commodoro, and it was actually me that got the fleet together. That's the reason for it. That's the exact reason for it. And you're right, it just seems like there's 218 ships. They couldn't draw the amount of ships needed to help with the Armada. Now, bearing in mind, the Romulan evacuation needed a hell of a lot more because of how many people were actually going to be involved. And they have talked about that, about what systems were going to be affected, and it was a lot more than what they were expecting and all that within the books and things. But Starfleet has had its problems over the years, yet they've somehow managed to get the best new ship in the fleet, and it's a copy of that. Slight different nacelles, things like that. I'm not a massive ship person. It doesn't really bother me about the classes in such a way, but mine is the fact that they've got this, all of a sudden they've got this fleet, and it's come out of literally nowhere. And Riker's displaced the captain. It's like the whole Captain Jellicoe thing all over again. And me and Tony like to talk about Captain Jellicoe quite a lot. So the fact that this captain's been displaced and Riker's taken over in such
Jellicoe
a quick...
can and Jellicoe does.
Yeah, you've always got to get one, haven't you? But yeah, so that's my concern anyway. It just felt like, you're right, with it's not feeling earned. You knew it was going to happen in Nepenthe when when Riker says, that I'm on service, I can get called in and things, but it didn't, there wasn't enough weight behind that for it just to be this massive armada of ships that have come from nowhere, where in my head they're kind of almost dystopian rather than utopian, because they're suffering and trying to get back to where they were, and there's no indication of that. So that's where I come in from it. We're at Picard's ultimate death now.
Well, not ultimate. It turns out
ultimate
very
death.
unultimate.
I'm trying to give it the surprise, but no.
Spoilers.
It's right. It's spoilers. Well, I think we said at the top.
Yeah, sorry, I may have ruined it out of the gate.
Yeah, it's fine. We have Picard's death here. How do you think that the Golem, this idea of this Golem works, and his idea of his rebirth? Even like sort of the little levity towards the end where he's like saying, well, 10 or 20 years would have done. But what did you make to that kind of Chekhov's gun or MacGuffin or whatever you want to call it with Picard's death? And do you think it was right to put that in, and rebirthing? What did you think to that?
What's interesting is that and again, like I've read Infused, there's a really good, I think it's a Hollywood Reporter piece with Siobhan and Goldsman, where they go back through the logic that they used in reaching this, and they talk about like the death of Picard being something he settled on relatively early, and then branching backwards kind of through the decision tree to get there. And it's interesting for two reasons, which is that, like, despite the fact that it seems like this decision and this arc was like the core of the season, it feels like a point where two of the core themes of the season are at odds with one another. And there's one of the themes that supports what the show does here, and one of the themes that is very much against it. And so it's kind of like there's a push and pull between them that's hard to reconcile. If you wanted to be charitable and you wanted to say, actually, this makes perfect sense, this is the right way to do this, ignoring like the practical reason that the reason why you do this is because you've got Patrick Stewart signed for Picard season 2, is because one of the big themes and journeys of the show and the series and Star Trek in general, and is arguably this combination of the human and the other, the idea of coming together and not being divided, of like being one thing and two things simultaneously. And this idea of, again, like even like think of Daj or Soji's kind of necklaces, the diode kind of necklace, which is two circles overlapping with one another, for example. But even think of, say, Spock, who is kind of, half human, half Vulcan famously, or even, and again, the only time that we're going to mention Narissa on this podcast, I suspect, after this point, the moment where she talks about the Seven as a half meat, this idea of being halfway between one transition state and another. And again, one of the things that I really like about Picard is that it focuses on his relationship with Data, his relationship with synthetic life forms, because that's one of the more interesting aspects of Picard's character over the entire run of Star Trek. Because if you look at the early seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation, one of the interesting things about Picard is that he's out of the gate relatively well-formed, in that, like, they know Patrick Stewart can give speeches, they know they want Picard to be a moral center, and they know that they want him to have a sense of self and pride and ego that works very well in response to, say, John Delancey's Q, to pick an example. But as you watch, as Picard becomes gradually more complex as the show evolves, one of the interesting aspects is his relationship with Data, and the sense that his relationship with Data is much more complicated than it might seem. So, like, look at the way he interacts with Worf over the course of the show, where he's generally cuts Worf a lot of slack with regards to what Worf does. When Worf asks him to kind of like to intervene in kind of like the, appointing of a successor to the Klingon Empire, or the or to represent him during his father's trial in Sins of the Father, Picard's like, yeah, sure, why not? Let's do this sort of thing. Or, when Worf murders Juros, Picard is disappointed, but he's like, no, I'm not going to actually put a proper sanction on your record. Don't worry. You'll still make Commander. This will be grand. That sort of stuff. Or even earlier seasons, like where the Klingons come on board in Heart of Glory, for example, where they're hanging out a lot with Worf. They're very suspicious. Picard's like, no, that's grand. Worf knows exactly what he's doing. I trust Worf. He's my buddy. He's my officer. He wouldn't be on my bridge if I didn't trust him. And if you compare that to how Picard acts with Data in the early seasons. So, for example, Data lore, where he meets his brother. He hangs out with his brother a lot. And Yara's like, are you sure you trust him? And Picard's like, yes, but in front of the bridge crew, I'm going to say it is entirely appropriate for you to ask if I trust Data to hang out with another robot, and should not be nervous about that whatsoever. In The Measure of a Man, where Data's asked to like volunteer himself for vivisection, Picard's first response to that is, well, why don't you? Which is terrifying. Well, why wouldn't you volunteer for the procedure? Data has to actually argue with him, and like Data has to change Picard's mind and go, well, look, if people decided that Geordi's visor was more efficient, would you ask people to rip out their own eyes? And I wonder if that's maybe a thematic reason why eyes are so important in this season of Picard, but maybe I'm reaching a little bit. But even like in the third season with The Offspring, which is another episode that's vitally important to Picard, Data has a child, and Picard's like, why the hell didn't you tell me that you were doing this thing? And Data's like, if Worf had a kid, he wouldn't tell you. And Picard's like, okay, fine, fair point. But you have this sense of Picard being a bit more uneasy about Data, and a bit more uneasy about robots and synthetic life forms and androids over the course of The Next Generation than he is about human life. And even think of, say, Quality of Life in the 5th or 6th season, I think it's 6th season, where like Data's like, these synthetic life forms are alive, and Picard's like, shut up, Data, which is, not exactly the most enlightened or kind of reasonable approach to this situation. But you have this idea of Picard basically being kind of blind, this being a blind spot for him. And even, say, his relationship with the Borg, where he's assimilated, and that's hugely traumatic to him and defines him. It's the loss of his humanity and kind of this intrusion of a mechanical element into him to render him somewhat less human. So I think there's something very clever and very effective and very thematically appropriate about the idea of Picard's arc as a whole over the course of his entire life being, I'm wary of these synthetic life forms. I'm not entirely sure that I trust them. One of them becomes my best friend, my student. I teach him, but interestingly enough, without me realizing, he also teaches me. And so the end of my journey is this kind of union with him, where I, who am somebody who has always valued my humanity and my, organic body and seen myself as being kind of separate or different or distinct from a synthetic body, am placed in one, and therefore become these two things together in one, and therefore kind of an embodiment of these kind of conflicting ideas, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And so I can see the union of Picard, or putting Picard in an android body, working in that sense in terms of the inner thematic logic of the season. And so, that's why it's not a huge problem for me, even though it is a bit of a problem for me. And the reason why it's a bit of a problem for me is the other theme of the season, the one that is very much at odds with this decision. And that theme is that idea that I mentioned of kind of parents and children, and the idea of parents reconciling with children and atoning with children, and Picard making up for his past wrongs. Because that story arc is very much building towards the idea of sacrifice and the idea of resignation and the idea of atonement. Because if you think about these stories, again, this is the Campbellian structure. The idea of, atonement with the father. Think of Star Wars, for example, where a large part of that is about Luke reconciling with his father. But the end of those stories is always the death of the father. It's always the father moving on so the son can emerge out of the shadow and move out into the world as their own person. And again, even in, say, and again, another Star Wars example of this, but think of Rise of Skywalker, not the Rise of Skywalker, sorry, think of The Last Jedi, for example. Please don't think of The Rise of Skywalker. But think of The Last Jedi, for example, where Luke has this journey, where he realizes that he needs to be out in the universe, and his last act is to buy the rebellion or the revolution time, or the resistance time to escape, so that they can go forward and they can inspire a new generation of children. He gives his life so that children can live and children can have a better future. And it really feels like Picard is building towards a moment like that, where Picard, knowing, he actually instructs Durante to inject that into him, knowing that it will accelerate his condition, knowing that it will cost him his life sooner rather than later, because he understands that doing it is important, that he can make a difference now. He can save these children now. He can make a choice and a sacrifice to protect them now, which will give them a chance later on to live the lives that they deserve to live. And it feels like that arc makes sense if Picard dies. That arc makes sense if the end of the season is Picard realizes that the generation that came after him, the next generation, if you will, have perhaps been disappointed or despondent or dispossessed, and that he maybe has some responsibility to them to make things right, and he does, and then he kind of gets off the stage, as it were. He kind of steps out of the spotlight. He says, I've done my bit. I've sacrificed everything that I have. I've given you a fighting chance. I've reconciled. I've made myself at peace with myself over the course of the season. I'm done. It's time to retire. I'd like to grow old gracefully. I'd like to, die in my bed, dream of my best friend, and kind of walk off into the great beyond, the final frontier, the undiscovered country. Which is not, it turns out, the future. But you have basically kind of that element of the show being at odds with the decision to bring him back, which does feel cheap and kind of a little bit tacky, a little bit kind of manipulative. That said, on second and third watch, actually, I found myself liking the sequence a bit more, because a lot of that stuff isn't actually about Picard. A lot of the sequence that you spend with the characters while Picard's gone isn't actually about Picard himself. It's about those characters. So you get like Seven and Rios together drinking mediocre alcohol, which is great. I really enjoyed that sequence. And again, they talk about Picard because obviously the death of Picard is on their mind. But what they talk about Picard is actually about themselves. It's about Rios finding faith that he thought he lost through Picard, and therefore coming out stronger the other side of it. You have Seven, who's a woman who has sacrificed her principles in order to get some semblance of what she believes to be justice satisfaction, but hasn't found any of that, but finding her way back to an important cause through Picard. And so you get these sequences that tell you about where these characters are now, and how where they are now is different from where they started because of Picard. And those sequences work really well for me because of that. because they don't feel like they lean too heavily on, well, Picard's dead, that's that, as opposed to this is where I am now compared to where I started. So on second and third watch, I like them a bit more than I did on first watch, where I was like, can we get to the bit where Picard comes back for the second season, please?
Yeah, and also not to forget Raffi's mothering of Elnor as well, which works really well on top of that, because I think that's you're right with that. And I think he says something as he dies to Raffi, wasn't it? Oh, you were quite right, is the final words that he says to Raffi as well. And he also summons Elnor to his side as well, which is a wonderful kind of illustration of what the show is about. Because, like, again, Elnor is, we mentioned Elnor is the wafer-thin, kind of paper-thin character in terms of, like, characterization development. But he's the one who arguably has the greatest symbolic weight, because he's introduced literally as a child. He's introduced literally as a child that Picard has taken as a surrogate child. And so therefore at the end, when Picard is dying, for him to reach out for Elnor is important, because it's always been about a father and a son. And it doesn't matter whether the father is humanity and the sons are synths. It doesn't matter whether the father's Picard and the sons are all us audience members who grew up watching The Next Generation. At its core, that's what the season needs to be about. And I really like that decision in his final moments to have him reach out for Elnor, despite the fact that Elnor is, to quote Monty Python, "wafer thin." Just while I'm thinking, with the Golem, do you think that Riker would have been happy had he been given the same time frame? Since the fact that he did mention, I think was it Generations, he mentions it when he says, "I plan to live forever," which I think would. Go on.
I think Riker would be much more likely to use his android. He'd be very disappointed if he got his android body and he couldn't sit down on the command chair of the Shen Z in the same way that he used to sit down in the chair in Picard's briefing room. Because it does feel like he's maybe not as spry as he used to be. It's like, we made some enhancements. We limbered up your hips. It's like, okay, that's grand. That's all I could ask for. That's all I want.
Just one question on just again going back, because I like to be meta. The podcast. The Star Trek CBS podcast, the talk to Patrick Stewart and to Kiva Goldsman, and one of the things that they say about this rebirth is that they were really interested into finding out what the reaction would be, because people were actively maybe against this, but the fact that you've now got Picard in a body, it goes back to what you were saying before about the Picard's resistance of the synthetic idea against Worf's, but now that Picard is that, and how the fans would react to that kind of feel to it, that he has become the very thing that he was not against, because that's not the way he was, but resistant to.
Unconsciously biased against. I mean, because again,
unconsciously
Picard,
biased, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of interesting. I mean, will it actually change anything? I mean, they've talked about how they want to explore the implications of that change in the second season. So, I mean, I suspect they will explore kind of what that means. It's kind of interesting, because you do wonder, like, what is that sense of self like? It's very similar to that Harry Kim situation that you talked about, like on Voyager, where, and again, part of me kind of likes that aspect of it, because again, there's that meta element. You talked about the meta element there, but like the logic of transporters in Star Trek, where you have, going back to, I'm trying to remember who wrote it, but it's Spock Must Die, which was one of the first tie-in novels, and like its central premise was that the transporter is basically an expensive fax machine that destroys the original copy. So every time you hop into the transporter, you are basically destroyed, and a copy of you is built somewhere else. So the real version of you in the Star Trek universe doesn't exist unless you've managed to never use a transporter ever, which is kind of an interesting and horrifying thought. And the Star Trek universe is kind of full of those, full of things that like characters walk off, which they really shouldn't, which is very similar to like, and again, part of the Deep Space Nine played this for comedy with Miles O'Brien, where Miles O'Brien would habitually go through these kind of stock science fiction plot devices, but the kind of like the cruel joke or human tragedy or human drama of it was that he reacted like a human being to them, and therefore they became horrific. So like hopping through time in Visionary is one of those examples. Harry Kim would do Visionary in his sleep. He wouldn't bat an eyelid at it, but like O'Brien has a near mental breakdown as a result. Hard Times would be something that, like, Paris would get over with a couple of memory implants from the Doctor, but it ends up being this thing that, O'Brien lives with over the course of an episode. And I kind of like the idea of Picard in a synth body being kind of like that version of a kind of arc over the course of a season, where maybe they kind of delve into the weird science fiction body horror of realizing that the body you're in isn't quite your own. And again, part of me wonders again, like, can you do that these days without kind of getting into subtext that is perhaps going to be thorny and kind of, lead you in directions that I'm not entirely sure a show like Picard is able or willing to go. But I think there's certainly material to mine there and material to explore.
We do move into the basically the end of the episode with this complex quantum simulation. And I'm sure that a lot of people will be looking forward to this particular element of the podcast with the last 18 or so minutes. Picard says it's not another damn dream. And which I thought was quite a nice entrance into it, actually. But there's a lot of like interesting writing with this. I think the writing is particularly strong in this, and it's just it's very, very even simple things, the simplest things like "Yes, Captain," for example. You just using those callbacks to bring up the nostalgia for a start off, but also actually bringing it into the now, and it seems resonant in the fact that before this 10 episode season, the last thing we saw was Nemesis, and this is the ramifications of that, and the fact that Picard's been dealing with this for over so many 14 or so, whatever many years it's been. It's even more than that, it's 20 odd years or whatever. How do you, what were your initial, before we actually delve into it, what were your initial thoughts on it when you first saw this come into play?
Again, well, this is one of the things where Chabon is a novelist, and you can kind of tell that here. And again, part of me is a little disappointed that Chabon's not sticking around for the second season, in large part because he's a really great interview subject, and he's really good on social media. His Instagram is fantastic and well worth a follow if you want to look at some behind-the-scenes stuff there. But I mean, there's something very writerly in the structure of this, something very organized and very kind of like well thought through, which kind of suggests a writer sitting down and having an idea of where they're going to go. Because I mean, famously, the season opens with that dream of Data and Picard together, and so it closes with another, not a damn dream, but Data and Picard together again. And it feels, it's this wonderful sense of kind of symmetry around it. And again, you have this almost kind of magical, realist, kind of almost fantastical element to it, where, the wonderful shots, the set is fantastic, but the shots kind of the camera kind of moving over stuff, so it's not entirely detailed. It's like the chateau, but the clock doesn't have a face on it. Everything's kind of grey. The kind of portrait frames are empty. So it does have this kind of otherworldliness that you didn't really see that much on on Star Trek, outside of maybe the Orb experiences on Deep Space Nine, and even those tended to just kind of turn the saturation up and kind of like sepia tint everything and like add a lot of black lighting. This is like genuinely kind of weird in a way that, say, 60s Star Trek could be genuinely weird, like Mark of Gideon and stuff like that, where you have the kind of sets that are just primary colors, and I really, really like that aspect of it. I thought it was very good. And I think, to bring it back to, you mentioned Nemesis there, one of the things that I admire a great deal about Picard, about the series, and again, this is one of the things where I have problems with it, but I really like it in general. My problems with it is that Picard could sometimes be a little bit fan servicey, and not in ways that served the plot and not in ways that made sense. I'm thinking, for example, of Stardust City Rag, for example, where they beam down to Free Cloud and Mr. Motts has franchised for some reason, or Quark has franchised for some reason, which doesn't feel like it's in character for Mr. Mott, but it also feels like it's against the laws of the Star Trek universe for Quark to earn enough money to set up a sustainable franchise. That sort of logic doesn't feel like it works. But one of the things that I've really appreciated about Picard is that it feels like it's written by somebody who has a genuine in-depth appreciation of the Star Trek universe. And so its callbacks and references have been decidedly esoteric. They're, obviously it references First Contact, it references The Best of Both Worlds, it references The Measure of a Man, the big episodes of Star Trek that everybody loves. But one of the things that I find fascinating about it, and I really admire about it, is how much of it references episodes that people would rather forget, or would rather kind of brush aside, or nobody's really thought about in a long time. Something, for example, of Kestra Riker Troy, who's obviously named for the sister from Dark Page, for example. Yeah. And and even has the blonde hair of the sister as well, which reminds you that, those genes must be in the family pool somewhere for her to have the blonde hair like Kestra did, to pick an example. But even things like, say, the Romulans and the Borg coming together, like in the Neutral Zone, which is a famously, terrible episode of Star Trek. But even, say, the presentation of Free Cloud is something that happened after the collapse of the Neutral Zone, which reminds me a lot of, say, Paradise City on Nimbus 3 in Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. But even how much of this show derives from Nemesis, which is not a good movie. Nemesis is like, what a terrible, terrible, terrible movie. Anybody who doesn't like the J.J. Abrams movies should be made to sit down and watch Nemesis on loop until they come to their senses. And I say that as somebody who has problems with a couple of the Abrams movies, to be fair. But like, Nemesis is pretty bad. But I adore that Picard looks at Nemesis, takes it at face value, thinks through the implications of at least some of its ideas, and finds a way to tell a story that kind of spins outward from that in ways that you wouldn't imagine necessary. Like, generally speaking, I'm wary of nostalgia and revisiting and stuff like that, and kind of going back and repeating and retreading, right? But one of the things that I think Picard gets away with is that Nemesis was such an unsatisfying conclusion of the relationship between Picard and Data that Picard gets away with basically going, nah, we're actually going to do a proper Picard says goodbye to Data story over the course of 10 episodes, because Nemesis was so bad that we kind of need to go back and redo it. Data needs to have a proper goodbye sequence. And again, even in that sequence with Picard and Data, Data talks about how there wasn't time, or Picard talks about how there wasn't time to have a proper farewell between the two of them because of how Nemesis was written and structured, how the scene was cut and edited and stuff like that. And I kind of really like that Picard, almost, and again, this depends on how much you like Picard, I suppose, but how much Picard redeems Nemesis, which is something that is, like, insanely ambitious if you're doing a nostalgia-driven project. Like, imagine going into the writer's room on the first day, picking up a blue marker, and writing on the center of the board, Star Trek Nemesis, and drawing a big circle around and saying, that's what we're doing. That takes cojones, and I really admire Chabon for doing it. And being frank, I think he pulls it off.
The even thought that the actual, decision that will make. Well, how did before get Data's memories? It was before he died. He hasn't got the idea of death. He hasn't experienced that death yet. Picard has, and the juxtaposition between the two of them and that conversation that they have, that the Data wants to be human. He wants to experience all those things. He's always wanted to experience the good and the bad, and just the way that they've found that from, as you say, from Nemesis, from that one thing, that something that was taken away from us as a viewer, as well as much as the narrative of the show. That was the goodbye that we got. It was emotional at the time, yes, but to then find the human side of his death, and it makes it so resonant for us as a viewer to see this like unfold. I mean, I don't know if you've got the notes actually of what was said within that those scenes, but some of the actual, as you say, the writing and stuff. I mean, I don't know if you want to pick up on what I've just said there with regards to the little things that they thought about over the course of that, giving that idea of Data not having a death, and what Picard eventually does for him.
And even things like Picard saying that he regretted never telling Data how much he loved him as well, which is, again, one of those things that is a huge Picard beat. Because even in this series, you've had like jokes about Picard not being able to hug, and somebody telling Picard that she loves him, but he doesn't have to tell her that she loves him back. But like, even like, over anybody who has watched like The Next Generation knows Picard is an immensely repressed person. He's an immensely boiled down, buttoned down person who keeps to himself. And so it feels entirely organic that in that moment before death, having had a friend who he lost nearly 20 years ago sitting right in front of him, that Picard actually takes that opportunity to say, yes, I never told you how much I loved you. And Data with that innocence of a child. And again, this is the wonderful thing about Data as a character is that, like, Data thinks he's incapable of emotion. Like, Data believes he's incapable of emotion. But, like, over the course of the show, if you watch, he is, in his own way, profoundly capable of things like love, even if he doesn't process them or register them as love, even if he's not incapable of kind of articulating them or kind of understanding them or analyzing them. It's very clear from watching his behavior that he is capable of these things. And
yeah,
even
I mean, the
here,
very comment that he makes there, doesn't he? He says, well, a small but statistical part of my memories, hope it brings you some comfort. You know, those very dry words are written for Data to be delivered, but they hit so hard because of what Data has been, and that's the way that he processes that information.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the line I was thinking about, was the response to that, where it's something that is so innocent, but it's both perfectly exactly what Picard needs to hear as a person in that moment, which is that it doesn't matter that you didn't tell me that you loved me, I knew anyway, but which also says, and knowing that was important to me as a person as well, and communicating that in the way that Data does, which is so efficient and so beautiful and so elegant, is just amazing. And again, the sequence... And again, this is one of the things where I mentioned at the start of the hour, and again, I guess if this feels like a nice bookend as we reach the kind of the end, but it's the bit where, Siobhan kind of sets up this idea of mortality, and it runs through the entire kind of show, runs through the entire season. And even here, you have that butterfly, which you mentioned, you mentioned earlier on at the start as a metaphor for freedom. And the butterfly is a metaphor for freedom. And Data says that, an important part of that metaphor for freedom is ending, is the idea of a conclusion and kind of wrapping up. And Siobhan is a very clever writer in terms of structure. And again, I mentioned this at the start, and it's worth bringing up again just to kind of round off the hour, I think. But it's that he understands that you expect a death or a payoff at the end of this. And it's clever of him to, maybe look like he's giving you Picard and then give you Data instead, because you don't expect Data. As far as you're concerned, Data's dead. Data's story's over and done with. And yet he brings him back. He brings him back for about 10 minutes, and then he kills him off. Then he has his life come to an end. And it's incredibly moving and incredibly affecting. And it is that kind of like writery trick of a sleight of hand, where it's like, okay, fine, I can bring Picard back because you're still wiping your eyes from watching Data die, even though you didn't know that Data dying was going to be on the table when you came in here, which is kind of a very clever bit of writing where a part of me is like, yeah, I see what you did there. It's, very calculated. Somebody did the proper maths to get this to work and balance out. But part of me is also like, yeah, I kind of got a little bit, wiped a little kind of bit of moisture from the corner of my eye watching it.
Yeah, I think it was amazing, and I think as I say, with the having that as a finish was moving, and it was also just it was just so well written. And it just feels like, as you say, it's a sleight of hand. It's the way that it's been really kind of done to effect. But at the same time, I don't care, because it just worked really, really well, and I think that it just gives you that I've got no words, literally don't. But one thing, I don't know if you are aware of this, but Blue Skies that was on the singer is actually Isa Briones, who actually plays Soldier. Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's amazing. Is there any
Yeah, so I'm totally taking that in my head canon as that's her singing it in the eulogy. That's definitely the way I'm taking it. And the DH Picard as well.
I was going to say, we do get Patrick Stewart quoting Hamlet, which is again one of those nice. It's incredibly moving, but also it feels like necessary to have wrapped up a Star Trek Next Generation kind of reunion show to a certain extent.
Yeah, is that the eulogy?
That's the eulogy,
the eulogy bit, yeah. I think the way the eulogy really works as well, just the way that they've de-aged Picard as well during the actual as Data ages, and I thought that was really, really sweet as well, the way they did that. And then we kind of move on from that, and the eulogy comes in. Picard talks about his age, which we talked about. Is there anything else that you would? I mean, the end scene is Picard saying "engage," and away you go. We've now got this. It's almost like an end of a pilot episode, isn't it? That the gang are here and we're going to warp into the next story. But is there anything else that you would like to talk about with regards to that data scene? Anything that jumps out at you?
Not really that much. It's just really, really sweet and really, really well done and really gentle. It is a little odd that they couldn't get Jonathan Frakes to kind of stand around in the background. Because you kind of wonder, like, how that went down. Like, where it's like, Riker's commanding the Sheng Zi, and it's like, oh, what happened? Picard saved the day, and he had a massive attack. That's grand, I'll go deal with some bureaucracy. You guys take care of this stuff. Like, does Riker know Picard? Well, first of all, does Riker know Picard died? Second of all, does Riker know Picard was resurrected? It's kind of interesting to wonder how that kind of goes. I know this is kind of nerdy and kind of beside the point and not necessarily in the spirit of the emotional context that we just talked about, but it does seem a little odd.
Yeah, I mean, at the end, just before that scene, when he says he's going off to the fleet and he's going to follow Commodore Owen and escort them back, and Riker does say, doesn't he, say something like, I'll see you soon, my friend, or something, and then when we go back to Picard, he says adieu, because obviously Picard knows that this is the end. I've got a feeling, personally, that they may well have not had him on the set
available for the days, because it was the Discovery set where they shot the bridge. The Bridge of the Shen Zi is very clearly a redress set of the Discovery Bridge, which is fine. Yeah. That's how Star Trek works. The Defiant and Voyager bridges were redressed several times over the course of their shows, and the Battle Bridge was constantly reused in The Next Generation. So I do wonder if maybe they had they had Frakes for a couple of days somewhere in, it's Toronto, isn't it? Is it Toronto?
Yeah, I mean, he could well be directing an episode of Discovery or something like that as well, couldn't he? The logistics of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, I love the idea that he's directing it in costume.
Yeah, I'd like to see those pictures. One thing I did want to mention actually is the synthetic span's being lifted as well. So that is kind of puts that to a close, doesn't it, as well? So, and that brings us to the end of the episode. So, Darren, we need to go into the mailbag. Are you ready to make it so?
I'm ready to engage with any and all reader comments.
Right, yeah, so we have the Make It So, a Star Trek Picard podcast fan group. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in that group. I put a comment out on there for the mailbag yesterday, and we've managed to get 23 comments, so it's not bad going, seeing it's the end of the show. But let's have a look at what some people have said, and we'll get our thoughts on them. So Pamela Stafford says, loved the data goodbye, loved the butterfly line, a little confused about Nerek. What happened to him exactly? Did they just leave the Borg cube behind? A little bit of an odd rhythm to the show, much like the season, but overall happy with both. So yeah, so I think we've discussed a lot about that, haven't we? The fact that it kind of does have an odd rhythm, and what the Borg cube being left behind as well. But it goes back to that Death Star thing, doesn't it? I think that would just be, I think the development of the XBs will be potentially something they may well talk about in season 2. AJ Black, I wonder who that is.
Who is that?
I thought, who is that? What's he doing? I thought it was on the whole very good, though primarily because what a wonderful final 20 minutes. I'll talk about this when we record the wrap-up episode, but I think the last 20 minutes is by far the most TNG era writing we've seen in this era of Star Trek yet. It was just a wonderful way to bring closure to Data in a way Nemesis robbed us of. I'm genuinely surprised, given that this season has been what this season's been like, that they took the time and space to end the season like this, and I was delighted. Everything else, decent but unremarkable. The stakes ended up being so high, which meant nothing, as cool as glimpsing that Lovecraftian machine beast he was. And you see, he's mentioned it as well. The Zatfash didn't amount to a hill of beans. What a shame. Soji and Sung's loyalty flip-flop is all over the shop. 7 is again wasted largely. We've talked about that. Nerissa's death just showed how crap a character she was. He really doesn't like her. I can't even remember what happened to Narek. That's how little I paid attention to him. Sutra just, yeah, I know he has this thing. Sutra just ends up cast aside after all the build-up, and seeing Riker aside, although he really should have been on the Enterprise G or something. All that stuff I didn't give a toss about because I knew it was just magically be waved away, and it was. But that last 20 minutes made it worthwhile. More of that in a measured, less than the universe's end in season 2, please. The show can be more confident in itself now. all the building blocks are there. Well, that's an interesting comment he makes about the universe's ending. You know, the stakes are so high. Yeah. So what do you make to that? Do you think that it had to go that far to give us the themes that we've got, and can you see season 2 pulling back away from that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I find it amazing that I opened the episode going, I may be a little bit critical of this. And it's like, no. It turns out Darren actually comparatively loves the episode. Trust me, this is the least critical version of this podcast you were ever going to get. But more to the point about, like, you talked about in terms of the apocalyptic stakes and kind of like the, again, biocidal threat that is posed to the universe. Yeah, it is a bit much, to be absolutely frank. And again, this is a problem that's not just common to Star Trek, but it's common to absolutely all media everywhere now. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because special effects are cheaper. Maybe it's because everybody else is doing it and you feel a need to compete. Maybe it's because your stories are longer and so therefore you assume that in order to justify length they need to have higher stakes. But it's things like in The Rise of Skywalker, Star Destroyers being equipped with weapons from the Death Star just because. And don't worry, we're not going to explore it because we're only going to show one scene of them destroying a planet and assume that's enough to kind of counter matter for. And I do think that, yeah, one of the problems with Picard is the sense in which it has to absolutely be apocalyptic. I think that it's one of the things that Damon Lindelof has talked about when he talks about like why he doesn't write that many Hollywood blockbusters anymore. He talked about, I think, after Star Trek Into Darkness, when he was kind of like asked questions about the destruction of San Francisco in that movie and whether or not that was a bit excessive. And he was like, well, you're told in meetings, like you're told by producers that you need to have this element there. You need to have stakes that are this high in order to justify what we're going to do or the budget we're going to give you or what we're going to expect from box office on opening weekend. And I do wonder if there's a sense of that in Picard, where it's like, we're doing a season-long story, we're bringing back Patrick Stewart, this is obviously costing a lot of money, we need this to matter in inverted commas, and in terms of making it matter, it needs to be about absolutely everything. And again, you know, part of me is like, yeah, I can see that being a problem, and I think it is a problem. The other part of me is like, yeah, well, I mean, let's face it, the original Star Trek also had its share of apocalyptic threats. Doomsday Machine that was going to eat its way through Earth, for example, or the Wave of Madness in Operation Annihilate, for example, or, you know, little things like that where there's a sense of like everything is going to die if you get something wrong. So I can kind of almost justify it in that sense. But yes, I absolutely agree with Tony. It would be nice to have a smaller, more intimate, more character-focused version of the second season. Like, I watched the first season and I wonder why it's not enough to have a story that's simply about Picard finding and saving Data's lost daughter. Why that's not enough of a stakes or scale to anchor 10 episodes of Star Trek. Why it needs to involve Romulan conspiracies, and why those Romulan conspiracies need to involve not just the destruction of Romulus or the destruction of Earth, but the destruction of the entire universe itself. It feels like it's a bit much, to be honest.
Okay, so what we're saying is somewhere between a soap opera on a vineyard and the apocalypse of the entire universe. Somewhere in between.
Was it Siobhan when Siobhan interviewed by the Hollywood Reporter saying that he absolutely would love to have written a series in which Picard solves the mystery of the missing church bell in the local village? And it's like, I would absolutely love to watch that too. Thank you very much.
Well, we can have a mini-sode. We can have mini-sodes of them. I'd love to see that. Going back to the mailbag, as I say, it's been quite a popular one. So Anna Meadows Helvey, apologise. As I said everywhere, I love the show and I love this episode. However, much felt abridged, sketched out with pencil quite intriguingly, but not filled in with colour. The Sung arc and the Sutri story, I needed to see more of. I feel that there was perhaps too big a story for 10 episodes. 12 would have allowed more fleshing out of the key plot points. I still love it, and I think that for a first season it does a good job of bringing closure to some unfinished character ideas, as well as introducing new characters I care about. As far as Narek, he must still be with the synths, or maybe he was able to hail some Romulans and go home, although it doesn't sound like there's much to go home to. I hope to see him next season.
And he hasn't been heard from synth.
Yeah. I'm getting comments as we speak as well. Heimholtz
live
Watson,
podcast.
I know it's live. This is live radio, folks. Heimholtz Watson. As far as the first season of Star Trek go, that was pretty spectacular. Okay, there are some story points, including Narek and Narissa, that could have been executed better, but I can live with that. What I did like is the series started with a universe that was full of death and destruction, and by the end of it, felt like the old TNG universe. I knew it had found peace again. The whole season felt like one big TNG episode in that respect. Okay, he does go on to say a lot, but we've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to leave it at that one. So Zach Moore says, I have so many thoughts, but for now I'll leave it at my moment by far was Riker showing up with the fleet, which would have been nice not to be spoiled about his appearance in the opening credits. That was done with both him, 7 of 9 as well. That was spoiled in the episode. I think there was another one during the course of the season. Brent Spiner as last episode as well. Just to comment on also, Marina Sirtis didn't get a guest star or anything as well, which I thought was pretty poor really. Plus he hadn't. So yes, he talks about he hadn't been on the. Had he been on the Enterprise E, F, or G, any letter would have done. Plus, if he hadn't been in retirement on a backwater planet literally one day previously, but hell, that's part of it. Brett Williams says, this one left me conflicted, hate to see the series end, and as much as I enjoyed the epic level finale, I definitely feel it was rushed. I didn't agree with those that felt the first half of the season dragged, but with the season as perspective, they could have spread it out better. The showdown between Romulan Federation armadas began and ended way too fast. That said, love me some scenery chopping Frakes in full glory. Really did not care for they put Picard in the golem that ages and dies at a normal pace and has no advantages of a synth. To move it forward, couldn't had this imagination tool fix his brain. Which is a good point, actually. That imagination tool could have fixed his brain.
But I mean, like, maybe, but would you also trust Raffi's imagination to fix your brain?
Maybe not.
Jurati doesn't exactly have a good record when it comes to treating critically ill patients either, to be fair. Who gets to hold the imagination tool while they're fixing your brain? Because it feels like it can have a very different result depending on who's doing it.
Oh, yeah, that is a good point. That is a good point. Yeah, maybe not so much, but yeah, thank you for that. Colleen A. Costello, thank you again. She's been commenting on quite a lot of the weeks that we've been on. Good for you, Agnes. That secret agent line was great.
Yes.
Elnor's, yeah, like you said you really enjoyed that line, didn't you? So good for you, Agnes. That secret agent line was great. Number 2, Elnor's silhouette following Narek out of the Borg cube was a good visual. I loved that, and it got me pumped for the rest of the story. That reminded me of Star Trek Into Darkness. I don't know about you. You know, when they're coming out of the Borg cube.
Yeah. Oh, with the light, the single column of light, and then moving through it. Again, Goldsman's probably not. I mean, he's a good director. One of my issues with Picard is that it feels very TV at times. And I mentioned the music, for example, is part of that, and some of the lighting in some of the scenes also is a little bit part of that. I mean, I didn't think that Picard was as cinematic as it could have been, but I did like that shot. I did really like that shot of the two stalking each other out as well. And I kind of like it. It's interesting where it feels like another one of those, if you had more time, you could do something interesting with it. The two Romulans in the primary cast interacting with one another. And you get a bit of that at the campfire scene where Elnor, dismisses... Elnor, who, by the way, is literally an elf. I love that he dismisses Narek's beliefs as just stories and myths and fairy tales. It's like,
that's a good point,
what you believe is nonsense. But it kind of feels like maybe we could have got a little bit more of that. Sorry to distract from the comment.
No, that's great. No, that's a good point. Sutra getting busted by Saga's memory. I actually laughed at how big a fail that was on Sutra's part. And then Sung's disappointment dad line about them being no different than us was just the icing on the cake. Number 4 was by Narissa. Your death isn't even worth talking about. Fair play. Number 5, what happened to Narek? I think that's going to be a line of a lot of people. He's probably under lock and key on La Serena, but honestly, I don't really care. 6, that's interesting that she's not really that fond of Narek as well.
She have a little Where's Waldo book, which is just a picture book where you just kind of find Narek. Is he on Risa? Narek. Yeah, find Narek. He's on Risa, and then it's like you turn the page, and it's like, oh no, that's San Francisco, and it's like, yep, you get points if you can spot him on each page.
Yeah. Number 6, please tell me they got to keep the magical Fix-a-ma-Bob. Now, this is a thing that they might just store away and never use ever again. I've got a feeling that will happen.
Khan's magic blood.
Yes.
Or like the Golem technology, because again, the Golem technology is something like Khan's magic blood, where you reckon in universe it should have something that breaks the logic of the universe as it exists. And again, it's not, people criticize the Abrams movies and kind of Discovery and Picard for this sort of logical failure, but it happens all the time as well. Remember when 7 of 9 cured death on Voyager? In what was the name of the episode? The one with Neelix where he dies. It was Brian Fuller's Christmas episode, and it was. I kind of love that Brian Fuller's Christmas episode was Neelix dies and realizes that there's no heaven. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Yeah, that's a wonderful sentiment to end off with on Christmas, isn't it? Yeah, she also says that she saw the Gollum thing coming a mile away. I actually did as well. It was one of those, well, that's how they're going to get away around that, aren't they?
Yeah, gone on a mantelpiece, yeah.
Gollum on a mantelpiece. 8, did they really just ditch all the XPs, or did I miss something? So I think they can't. Do you think that the XPs will be touched upon next season? Is that something that you yourself would be particularly interested in seeing develop?
I would absolutely love to see it develop. My only concern is, and again, I suppose it's probably unlikely to happen with Picard being a synth and with kind of Soji being on the team and part of the regular cast. But it is the sense that like this season's story is done, and we consider it done because synth rights are now like resolved, and therefore the book is closed, and we assume that the X-Borgs, kind of the XBs, turned out to be okay in the end. That's kind of what I'm worried about, why they may not appear. I worry that might be a reason why they wouldn't appear. But I would like to see them. I think that, I think there's stories there to be told. I think it's interesting, and I think that you can use them as a potent metaphor for just about anything. I think in terms of today, in terms of assimilation, in terms of immigration, in terms of access, in terms of any number of kind of metaphors for social commentary, the XBs are incredibly useful, and they're just a fascinating concept. And one of the things that I really, really liked about Picard, because they get into that sense of like the universe kind of breaking down, of like Starfleet failing, the Romulans like becoming decentralized and disorganized, and the Borg collective, kind of being this kind of mess of just people who are disconnected from one another. And I kind of feel like there's a story to be told there, and more stories to be told there, and crucially, kind of interesting ways in which you can follow those threads, I think, relevant to the world today.
I think I would echo what you're saying. I think they won't. If they were to bring it back in an overarching story, a major plot point, it would be nice to see that. But I don't think they will go down there. I think they'll look for a different story. Potentially, what I could see them doing is coming back to the XBs as an idea and a thought and an allegory of some sort, because you don't necessarily have to have the whole show dealing with it, but you could bring an XB back, couldn't you? You could not even back. You could have an element of that story somewhere and use those XBs differently, even if it was just 1 or 2 episodes or something.
I was about to say, similar to the episodic structure you see here, where you bring back Riker and Troy for Nepenthe, for example. Where you kind of like, you have an episode, and that episode is like, well, the XBs, and we're going to deal with them in the context of our overarching plot, And I can see that maybe happening. Which again is interesting, because people talk about how Discovery and Picard aren't episodic, but they very clearly are in terms of how they're structured. So I could see there being an XB episode next year, but you're right, I think that the season puts so much emphasis on synthetics and synthetic rights and like Starfleet coming back to being who they're supposed to be, that I can't see them doing another season arc with the XBs. Although part of me kind of loves the idea that Narek gets a job helping XBs integrate again, and then that plot gets ditched halfway through the second season, and he just wanders around aimlessly for the last 5 episodes as well.
Yeah, that would. Can you imagine if that's just reoccurring theme that he just every time he just peers up, he lasts for 4 episodes, and then for the remaining, he just ends up in a ship following people.
And occasionally, like throwing rocks at things. Remember me.
Yeah, he's like a poor man's Harry Mudd.
Yeah.
Oh God! Craig Mackenzie again, another guest who's been on the show. He says it was probably the best they could do under the circumstances. Soji's choice meant very little because she's not really a character in her own right. Sutra was dispatched far too easily, and what happened to Sung's shiftiness? Narissa died as she lived, pointless, and 7 of 9 didn't need to be there at all. We've kind of gone over that as well. Soji's choice, though, she's not really a character in her own right. What do you think to Craig's comment there, then?
I kind of love the idea that Soji's choice is an alternate universe Meryl Streep Oscar-winning movie, by the way.
Sophie's choice, yeah.
I actually, like, to be fair, I kind of don't mind Soji that much. And again, I think that Nepenthe actually worked rather well in terms of defining Soji's character as a breather episode, because it's an episode where the characters aren't running. They're actually in a place for an extended period of time. And again, I think that there are some pacing issues with kind of Discovery and Picard era Star Trek. I think everything moves too quickly. But I do think that you do occasionally get these episodes where characters kind of sit down and talk to one another and actually are in place and develop themselves and have these arcs. And I think that you do get a sense of who Soji is, where she's coming from, and what her attitudes are. And I think her decisions generally make sense in that context, in that, like, as we joke about how pointless Narek is as a character. And again, I kind of love how pointless he is in the second half of the season. But in the first half of the season, the dirtbag Romulan ex-boyfriend kind of is part of the reason why Soji's pushed in the direction that she is over the course of the show, because she trusted somebody and opened herself up to him, and he betrayed her, and that defines her character arc going forward. So I don't think she's entirely, I don't think she's a blank slate. I think she's better defined than, say, Elnor, to pick an example. Sorry to keep picking on Elnor. But I don't think she's as developed as, say, the best of the cast, like, say, Rios or Raffi, and again, despite the fact she literally got away with murder, Durante.
Yeah, I think the thing I had with Soji, I'm just trying to think this in my head as well. I think the thing that I had originally with Soji was that the way that Daj came in at the very beginning, it gave you that sense of who you were expecting, because it built up so much about Daj and it quickly pulled the rug from underneath you, and then it took a while to get to Soji, and even to the point where partway through the season I was missing Daj, and it was like, we just need to, you know what I mean? It's kind of like getting to that point. So that was where I had issues with it to begin with, but. I think Soji is very different to Daj, and I think that works in a lot of ways. But I kind of do understand a little bit about what he's saying, but I still think that I would have liked to have seen Daj over Soji overall, but it wouldn't have worked because of the way that they've linked the two together with the mythos behind the Ganmadan as well. So I think that that had to go that way. It does go into quite a bit more detail, but I am aware that we're approaching the 2.5 hour mark on the podcast, so we better
sorry about
thinking.
this.
Yeah, so we better wrap that up. So I apologise if you haven't. I
love the fact that we have the goal to complain about Picard being too fast paced.
Yeah,
it's like, why can't they be more like us?
Yeah, why can't they be more? Just have a 3 hour epic. We could maybe try and push 3 hours 20 and go for an Irishman type epic sort of podcast, and we'll take it from there.
But that way you could fit in what happened to the XBs. You could give Narek a little closing scene where he's like throwing rocks at passing spaceships or something like that. You could have all the stuff that we think is missing from the episode as is. I think you could fit that in neatly.
I've just had a thought. Could we have Narek throwing rocks at all the spaceships that come in, like Space Invaders? That's
that's the defense plan after the Orchids. And that's if the Orchids don't work, Narek's just going to stand there and throw rocks.
Yeah. On that, I think we're getting delirious.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I quite like being delirious. It's certainly entertaining. But no, Darren, thank you very much for coming on and discussing episode 10 with us. It's been a pleasure to have you on Make It So. You will be back. We are expanding the universe of Make It So. We have a podcast with Tony. I'm not quite sure when that's coming out, but I think we're talking about that potentially at some point in the coming days, looking over season 1. And we're going to be looking into Star Trek Discovery as well. So we are starting to widen the canvas and start talking about other things within the Star Trek universe. And I'm sure that you'll be back.
Will you be making a rediscovery?
We might rediscover Discovery. I've actually just watched The Vulcan Hello last night, actually. So I'm on my re-watch now for rediscovery. But before we go, Darren, you have written about Star Trek, haven't you? And can you give us a bit of information about that and where people can find you online and what you're up to at the moment?
Cool. So yes, I run a blog. It's called The Movie Blog. It's with a 0 instead of an O in the word movie. But just Google Darren Mooney Movie Blog and it'll come back quite handily. On there, I have written reviews of most of the Star Trek franchise. So I've written reviews of every episode of Star Trek The Original Series, every episode of Deep Space Nine, every episode of Voyager, and every episode of Enterprise. I had wanted to do every episode of The Next Generation, but time has just kind of gotten away from me. So I've got the first 3 seasons of The Next Generation done. So I go through episode by episode. I give a kind of a discussion of the show, its themes, its its context, try to place it kind of in a sense of where it was when it aired, and kind of look at the world around it, both in terms of television, in terms of politics, in terms of American culture, and in terms of the larger Star Trek franchise. So it's a bit of an in-depth kind of dive on each of those, which I really enjoy. I'm really proud of them. I've been told that they're long, rambly, unfocused, and completely nonsense, which is great. That's the best praise I've ever received. No, generally speaking, people have actually been very, very kind. People have said really, really nice things about them, and I really enjoy that people enjoy them as well. So if you are interested in Star Trek, if you have a favorite episode, or if you want to go deep on something, maybe pick an episode, Google one of my reviews of them, give it a read. I hope you enjoy. In terms of other stuff that's going on that I'm part of right now, what I would mention is that I'm on a podcast called The 250 with my good friend Andrew Quinn. Again, you can Google us, find us. We're on Stitcher, SoundCloud, iTunes, wherever good podcasts are not sold. And also where not so good podcasts are also not sold. But we basically on that podcast go through the IMDb's top 250 movies, one movie at a time, once a week. So this will be releasing, I imagine, fairly close to recording. So this week we'll be discussing...
Fairly close. Darren, it's 2.5 hours long. And I've got to edit it, and it'll be out within 12 hours.
Jesus, I am so sorry, Kurt. I am so sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I know how to edit you, so you're fine. So, but yeah.
We take the first 30 seconds, and everything else is garbage. That's pretty much it.
But no, seriously, we've been trying to get these out as physically soon as possible, so
yes,
it will be
absolutely.
out literally tomorrow, Saturday.
So yes, listeners, Darren can take a subtle cue and is going to wrap up very quickly. So yes, we're talking about Contratiempo, which is the Spanish movie which is on Netflix. Because the quarantine has everybody kind of locked down, self-isolating, what we thought we'd do is we'd do a kind of a virtual world tour. We talk about movies on the IMDb list that are from around the world. So Contratiempo, which is a Spanish-language murder mystery film from 2016, which is available on Netflix around the world. We'll be discussing that with the wonderful Anya O'Connor. If you want to give it a listen, I hope you'll enjoy. If not, next week we'll be doing Infernal Affairs from Hong Kong as well. But thank you very much for having me on, Kurt, and I am so sorry about the length.
No, I expected it, Darren. Don't worry. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you as usual. We've got quite a few podcasts coming up that we're going to be on together, so I'm looking forward to all of them. Whether it be on the Xcast or the Time Is Now podcast that I'm on, or this one, and you've asked me to come on to your show as well, which will be great.
Yes,
I'm looking forward to
you'll be on the
doing
250
that,
in a couple of weeks. Actually,
I will.
I'm talking about the Truman Show. I do love that in 15 years' time or in 25 years' time, there'll be a moment where I'll have to realize that I've done a terrible injustice to you, and I'll have to embark on an epic quest that will save all life in the universe while I come to terms with the fact that I made you sit through a 2.5-hour podcast. I think that's the only logical conclusion to this.
Well, Sir Patrick Stewart has bought or managed to get hold of the chair that you sat in during the dream sequence at the end. So if I'm sitting in that chair, I'll be happy. But yeah, so we have what's coming up on the podcast and what's been happening on the network in the last couple of weeks. So that'll be coming up to you right now. My name's Kurt. I've been on Make It So. And until next time, which will be a season 1 review, engage.
Previously on the We Made This Network. We buy records.
Now, I know you wanted a record by the High Llamas.
Yeah.
Called Hawaii.
Yeah.
Now, if you look online, I don't think there's a single near mint copy left for sale in the whole world. But I managed to find you one, Tim. And I gave it to you. I was more happy giving it to you than you probably were receiving it. And what did you do when I gave it to you, Tim?
Played it and scratched it.
Yes!
It happens. You know,
Hey,
I
just wanted you to admit on
it.
air that you'd made a complete rickets with the record because, you know...
I sort of halved the value of it. But it's not about the money, is it?
No. It was
It's about my idiocy. That's what it's about.
Yes, absolutely.
Make It So, a Star Trek Picard podcast. On the official Picard podcast, the production designer was talking about how they were amazed by how great the Borg cube set was once they built it, actually. They thought it was going to be, they designed something, but they didn't quite anticipate how good it was going to be for reusing. So they've got these really good sets, but maybe they found that doing certain things was going to cost too much money. It's hard to say. I think it is a bit of a shame.
See, the more Star Trek changes, the more it stays the same.
Oh, well, there you go. without a mouse.
When you watch it on the Disney Life app, whenever you watch a film, it has a short sort of description that comes up every time you pause it.
Yep.
So I wrote it down because not knowing where this film was going to go, I just wanted to read it first and then come back to it later. It said, a heroic, inspirational adventure that will thrill beyond imagination.
These descriptions of this app is very vague.
Yeah, this could literally be talking about any action film ever.
Yeah, it literally could be Wonder Woman.
But what stood out for me was the use of the word inspirational, as if like...
Is he?
I know, exactly. I thought I'll write it down, and then by the end we'll go back and decide if that was true or not.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. Make It So, a Star Trek Picard podcast, was created and is produced and hosted by Tony Black and Kurt North. You can find the show on Twitter at Jean-Luc Podard and on Facebook in the Make It So, a Star Trek podcast fan group discussion group. Check out the We Made This network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and on Facebook by typing in We Made This, and you can find all of our shows on our website www.wemadethispod.com. Thanks for listening.